Sometimes a game in development gets its plug pulled before anyone gets to actually play the game, or sometimes a game will shut down, rendering it unplayable. It can be incredibly interesting when, after these games were not intended to be played by anyone, people get access to play the games. So here are 3 hours of games you weren't supposed to be able to play, but you can play them. There's a lot of canceled games that are now out there and interesting stories to go with them, so let's look at that. Ready, set, go. Spider-Man 4, like with Tobey Maguire, a movie that we never got, but then there also was supposed to be a game that we never got either. But let's back up a little bit. You see, back when the Spider-Man trilogy with, Tobey Maguire started up, Activision would land the rights to make the movie adaptation in video game form. And typically during this time period, Treyarch, the studio that's now known for like Call of Duty Black Ops, was like Activision's main Spider-Man studio. Treyarch had been around for a while and they worked on all sorts of games, but Spider-Man was kind of their staple before Call of Duty. Not only would they make Spider-Man's 1, 2, and 3, all based off of the movie adaptations, but they even went so far as to work on Ultimate Spider-Man for like PS2, Xbox, and GameCube, and Spider-Man Web of Shadows, which came out on PlayStation 3, Wii, Xbox 360, and I think Microsoft Windows too. But after 2008, which was when Spider-Man Web of Shadows released, Call of Duty World at War also released, and this kind of put Treyarch in a larger, important role under Activision for Call of Duty, as they would be in charge of making the alternating years Call of Duty games moving forward. So instead of the studio working on multiple projects at once, it would mostly be consolidated to one massive project, for the most part, which meant when handling this Spider-Man IP that Activision still saw a lot of value in, they wanted to shift to another studio, which is pretty interesting because they had to have been working closely with Sony to even know that Spider-Man 4 was moving on with production, as it supposedly was in pre-production around the, late 2000s. Activision went ahead and assigned the studio Radical Entertainment to work on the Xbox 360 and possibly the PlayStation 3 version, and Eurocom to work on a Nintendo Wii version that would ultimately release alongside Spider-Man 4, which was expected to release in 2011. Now, what's interesting about this is a lot of people knew about Eurocom working on the Wii version, which we've seen builds of that from years ago. However, nobody really knew about the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions, and that's where things get interesting. After the movie ended up falling apart and Sony chose to reboot Spider-Man altogether, the game's assets for the Xbox 360 version would end up being reworked into Prototype 2. Instead, a year later, Activision would choose Beenox, another one of their studios, to work on the Amazing Spider-Man and its sequel, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 video games instead. Eventually, 2 prototype builds of the game would end up leaking online, where anybody with emulation software or a modified Xbox 360 would be able to go and play the Xbox 360 version. And while there wasn't too much actually done in the game, as this game's development started after the first prototype game, it does seem like things were starting to come together, and obviously they had some direction from Sony as to what to include in the game, and it seemed like some of the villains that would have been in this game would have included Vulture, Mysterio, and possibly others like Vermin, which did show up in the Wii menu. This is just a really interesting game to get a closer look at now because we can see some of the mechanics, some of the encounters, like this whole helicopter ordeal that would have been in the game. There's various things that are already kind of polished in a pretty good extent, which means that this game could have ended up being really cool. I think it's always interesting to find stuff like this, especially because we never got to see what the movie could have been because the movie was canceled before production would have started. So this, in a way, is kind of the closest thing that we actually get. There were storyboards found in the files as well, kind of showing some of the intro sequences that were planned. These also look really cool, and it just makes me sad we never got that Spider-Man 4 movie. Tobey Maguire was kind of awesome. And while I know this is going to be an unpopular opinion, I do like Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man, or maybe I just think Andrew Garfield's a great actor. Of course, there was something really special about Tobey Maguire's trilogy. On the flip side of things, the Wii version of the game also would see a leak as well, and you could play quite a bit of Spider-Man 4 for the Wii. And in this case, while the game looks a little bit less polished than the Xbox 360 version, a lot of the locations were designed. Like, a lot of work went into this one. So that's really cool in itself to see. I really wish we could have seen what this would have ended up looking like to a much larger scale. Also, there's just a lot of random things that are scattered throughout the game that are kind of interesting to look at when you're at it. Well, I don't know. I just feel like this is something that is really cool, that is the whole reason that game preservation is very interesting. When we get builds of games that have these larger stories, these movie connections that end up never happening, the game gets canceled, and then all of a sudden sudden, over a decade later, pretty much, we end up getting to finally get a glimpse as to what was cooking behind the scenes, what people worked on at these studios. I don't know. Is that just me that thinks that's cool? But before we get into it, we actually have a new Xbox release that has sponsored this video, so sweet. Get excited, travelers. Genshin Impact is finally landing on Xbox November 20th. And here's a bonus. Just for logging on Xbox, you'll snag a free Wind Glider. Plus, if you're an Xbox Game Pass member, you'll get free primogems with every update. If you're new to Genshin Impact, now's the time to jump in. It's an open world RPG where you can explore this magical world full of elemental power, epic quests, and unforgettable characters. And you can play on mobile, PC, or console, switch between devices with its seamless cross-save. And cross-save means like your accounts can also be cross-platform. So if you played Genshin Impact before, you can log in on your Xbox to keep on playing. With the new version 5.2, we're welcoming 2 new characters. Meet Chaska, a 5-star warrior who rides her weapon through the skies, and Ororun, a mysterious 4-star with an incredible story. You'll also be able to explore a brand new area called Akhenaten, an ancient city corrupted by the Abyss, and take on thrilling events for amazing rewards. So what are you waiting for? Hit the link in the description down below to download Genshin Impact on your Xbox and start your adventure today. Some of you might remember that Perfect Dark got an Xbox Live Arcade release, which was a remake of the Nintendo 64 game. However, the game was like overhauled and the source code was utilized to run the game with better performance and HD textures. It was pretty cool. It would later be included in Rare Replay, but the story of this project actually had different origins. Originally, Rare and Microsoft wanted to see a full remaster of Goldeneye 007, one of the most successful first-person shooters of the Nintendo 64 era. I mean, this game was a massive hit. So it actually made sense that Xbox wanted to bring this game in one way or another to the Xbox store. Matter of fact, I think Xbox thought that they were definitely going to be able to secure the rights to release GoldenEye on the Xbox Live Arcade because they greenlit Rare fully working on a remake of GoldenEye using the same techniques that they would eventually go on to use for Perfect Dark. Now, way back in the day, there was like a little tech demo shown off of the first level of GoldenEye Dam in this new engine, and it was really cool. However, it would later come to light that the rights didn't quite work the way that maybe Microsoft had initially thought. You see, for a game like GoldenEye to be re-released, they would not only have to have approval from the James Bond IP itself, but also since the game was originally under an exclusivity deal with Nintendo, Nintendo would have to approve the game, and then Microsoft and Rare would also have to approve the game as well, which Microsoft was down to, but obviously not all parties involved wanted this thing to necessarily go out. Especially since during that time, Nintendo was, doing some other things with Activision, and James Bond was also doing some other things. Like there was like these other GoldenEye games that were called GoldenEye, but had nothing to really do with the original GoldenEye. There was a GoldenEye Rogue Agent, and then there was also like this GoldenEye game that was a reimagining of the movie, which was different, but the plot was kind of the same. A little weird. So not being able to secure full approval for this release, we never actually saw this project come to light. Matter of fact, a lot of people thought that development had just started and then it got scrapped and they moved on to Perfect Dark. But years later, we would find out that not only was the GoldenEye remaster project much further along than anyone anticipated, we would find out that it actually was pretty much finished. Like 99% of the way there. Achievements were already scripted into the game. This thing was pretty much launch ready before the plug ended up getting pulled on it. And eventually, years later, in February of 2021, the game would be leaked online as someone had purchased a dev kit that had the full game on it. Now, of course, there's still uncertainty as to what caused this game originally to have the brakes pumped on it, whether it was MGM or Nintendo that said no, but what's important is that the game finally would release. 14 years after its initial expected early 2008 release date, which would have marked the 10-year anniversary of the game itself. It was always a shame that this game never saw a release because it does seem like the development team spent a lot of time really polishing this up and making the game look just a whole lot better for the Xbox 360, but at the very least, with the game finally leaking online, players were able to access this game through emulation or through actual systems or modded consoles where you can go through and experience the game beginning to end as it was originally intended by Rare, and that's ultimately pretty cool. There was speculation that this game would be seeing a re-release as it was kind of rumbling around internally that Microsoft was doing something with the GoldenEye. However, when finally, a little bit later, GoldenEye would see a re release. It was essentially just a slightly modified version of the original N64 version that also simultaneously released on Nintendo Switch. But man, I don't know, I'm kind of digging this remaster version. It even had that option where you can press the back button and it would switch between old and new graphics, which was something that would later be adapted into other Microsoft projects like Halo Anniversary. And some of you might remember that I got a modded Xbox 360 specifically to look for that one Easter egg in Call of Duty 3. Well, now Goldeneye 007 could be playable on here, so I feel pretty happy about that. That's right, today we're talking about Counter-Strike Global Offensive, but on the Xbox 360 and PS3. Let's talk about Counter-Strike Global Offensive because this is getting wild. We're going to talk about the Xbox 360 version of CSGO. You know, when Counter-Strike 2 released, it was a little bit controversial because the shift to Counter-Strike 2 was forced on all players who were playing CSGO. Matter of fact, in the first couple of weeks of Counter-Strike 2 releasing, you couldn't even easily downgrade your game to CSGO and play on like community servers or anything like that. You were stuck with Counter-Strike 2. This would eventually change, though it's not like the simplest process in the world. You do have to jump through a couple of hoops because we tested it, and just loading up the legacy version doesn't really let you do much. And nowadays, there are community-run servers, but if you just wanted to jump on and play good old CSGO without having to jump through a bunch of hoops like down patching your game, you couldn't do that anymore. Unless you had an Xbox 360, because Counter-Strike Global Offensive released on consoles back in 2012. Sure, this game ran at a locked 30 FPS. And sure, render resolution was probably around 1280 to 720p. But you know what? It was classic Counter-Strike Global Offensive. What's really interesting is that the console versions of CSGO were not really treated all that well. Matter of fact, when Counter-Strike Global Offensive first came out, it actually was pretty unpopular by the community. People preferred Counter-Strike Source. However, the console versions of CSGO would continue to get support from Valve all the way through 2013, like a year after its launch. It got the same updates as the PC version and then was abandoned. And it's funny because during this time, Counter-Strike Source still had more players playing the game on Steam than the newer Counter-Strike. And the more I looked into this, the more interesting this ended up becoming. Because between the console releases of the game, it actually seemed like the PlayStation 3 version was better than the Xbox 360 version. While this game did not have crossplay, the PlayStation 3 version did have Steam integration, so you could like link your Steam name, I guess, to it, and it supported keyboard, mouse, and I guess the PlayStation Move controller as well. So like you could play with like mouse and keyboard on the PS3 version, which is ideal for a game like this. The Xbox 360 didn't have that, but the PS3 version would end up shutting down in 2018, while the Xbox 360 version is still online. Meaning that after Counter-Strike 2 released and all this other stuff that went with it, if you just wanted to jump on real quick and you had an Xbox 360 or you had an Xbox One or Xbox Series X and you had the digital version of the game, you could still play this old game, even if it was a 2013 version of Counter-Strike. Actually, there's a pretty good video by YouTuber WarSarcy Game Clips who broke down Counter-Strike Global Offensive on the Xbox 360 in 2023, so you guys can check that out. And while multiplayer matchmaking is not super popular, there are still players who will occasionally drop in and play. I'm sure if a community coordinated a game night or something, they could probably fill in some lobbies. The only downside here really though is that Counter-Strike Global Offensive would silently be taken off of the Xbox Live Marketplace back in 2023, so it does make access to this game a little bit harder and more challenging to get. Matter of fact, you can't even get a physical copy of this game because I don't think it ever released. It was digital only, and I haven't been able to see like any codes online or anything like that, so you'd probably have to find a friend who already had the game on their Xbox 360, who's still playing the Xbox, and then like game share with them, making the home Xbox thing. But yeah, I don't know. It might be a little hard if you didn't already have the game, but if you bought the game back in the day, you could still play it. It was really funny though when Counter-Strike 2 released, seeing the memes of people joking about going back to playing Counter-Strike Global Offensive on the Xbox 360. But yeah, that was the last one standing, hanging in there all that time later. And it might actually give a little bit of insight as to why ultimately Valve chose to update Counter-Strike Global Offensive and turn it into Counter-Strike 2, because if you remember, Counter-Strike Source was essentially siphoning players away from their new release. So instead of doing a separate release, they just updated the game, as much as people didn't like that. So weird world, but yeah, I just thought it was fun to mention that Counter-Strike Global Offensive on the Xbox 360 did exist, and still exists. I remember Timeshift being such an interesting game. As a first-person shooter game, it seemed like this was supposed to be like the next big Halo killer, and while it wasn't quite that, Timeshift still was an interesting game to say the least. But even more interestingly is the development here, because Timeshift originally started development like in the mid-2000s and was supposed to be published by Atari, but Atari ended up selling its publishing rights to Sierra in April of 2006, and Timeshift would see a couple of delays. But back in the mid-2000s, some of you youngsters might not know this, you could actually get Xbox demos when you would purchase like a Xbox magazine or something like that, or just there's various ways you could get these demo discs. You popped them in your Xbox and you can kind of play the game. There was also a demo released on PC, and this version of Timeshift is not the version of the game at all that would come in retail. The game would be substantially different, and while that might ruin the whole point of this game being included, I still thought it was relevant and interesting enough that I wanted to talk about it here, because it's not too often that a game releases a demo, everyone can play it, and then all of a sudden development on the game essentially completely is overhauled and restarts, and the final product of the game looks nothing like the demo that you were able to just pop in your disc and play. Usually demos don't happen publicly until the game's like about to be published. Nonetheless, there was a lot of negative feedback upon the release of the 2006 demo, so Vivendi Games and Sierra greenlit the game to be completely overhauled, where a lot of the bugs would be fixed, but also just the whole course of the game as well. It's interesting how much things change between the first version and the later version. Like, the main character was this character named Michael Swift, and he doesn't even appear in the final version of the game. Instead, the protagonist is like completely anonymous in the final release, but ultimately the game would release in 2007. What's even more interesting is when this whole reboot thing happened, Sierra Entertainment went as far as announcing the cast lineup for voice actors that were going to be in Timeshift. They were going to get Dennis Quaid, Nick Chinland, and Michael Ironside all to voice characters. Okay, maybe it's not that bad. They didn't have to cut every single audio line. It's just that Dennis Quaid's role was completely eliminated, though they did still keep Michael Ironside playing the character Dr. Crone, and it seems like Nick Chinland's lines also made it into the final game. But yeah, too bad for Dennis Quaid. But despite the fact that Dennis Quaid was supposed to be the protagonist, his entire role was canceled and he was not put into the final game. I guess they opted into making the character a silent protagonist, and yeah, so they hired him, had him do all the lines for nothing. Though it seems like the other two voice actors did have their roles continue to be in the game. But it is interesting, there is a lot of footage out there of Dennis Quaid's character and interviews with him for this game that he didn't even get to be in. So while the final product of the game looks dramatically different from what it was, you still can go back and play that demo or play the PC demo that released and see what the game was like. And I think that's still cool. Cool way to preserve what was built and developed for a long time, even if things are restarted and, changed. To this day, I'm still very surprised that Thrill Kill ended up getting canceled, especially with the game pretty much being fully finished. You see, back in the late 90s, this game, Thrill Kill, was being developed by Paradox Development for the PlayStation 1, and it was supposed to release in 1998. There was an interesting premise, right? So we have 10 people who were all sent to hell after dying, in their regular earthly life, and they're forced by some goddess to fight to the death, and, you might get a chance at reincarnation. Lucky you. There was actually a pretty big following for this game before it even released, where media outlets were reporting on the game and people were interested to see what this game would turn into. This was the 90s, where like fighting games popularity was at an all-time high, and this game advertising it was like the first ever 4-player 3D fighting game. It was kind of a big deal. But here's where things get interesting. You see, Paradox Development had partnered up with Virgin Interactive to publish this game, and as they were working on a game, the publisher kept stepping in saying, hey, make things more violent, go all out. And eventually they landed on whatever this is. But here's the thing, you see, during the late 90s, there was this big push for more and more censorship in video games, and there were all these hearings and different things, and the ESRB was established. And even though nowadays there's multiple scientific studies that suggest violent video games are found not to be associated with violence or adolescent aggression, this was still a really, really big topic towards the end of the 90s. And I guess it is still a pretty big topic nowadays, right? Although, as we've seen with games like Grand Theft Auto, a little controversy can go a long way in how a game performs and how many people are talking about the game. So it was a really big deal when Thrill Kill would be one of the first games to ever receive the adults-only rating by the ESRB. And mind you, this was the first game to receive the rating just because of its violence alone. Although, honestly, by today's standards, I don't know. But this is what ended up happening with the game. During everything that was going on, all the controversy around video video games being too violent, EA was behind the scenes trying to prove that video games as a whole wasn't too violent for consumers. And at the same time, EA had taken over the North American operations for Virgin Interactive, thus meaning that the responsibility to publish the game now fell on EA. So with all this going on in EA's efforts to try to change the narrative around the gaming industry, the executive board ended up choosing not to release Thrill Kill, thus canceling the game. Actually, according to a VG 24/7 interview with the senior programmer David Ullman, who worked on the game was already 99% finished, and a sequel game had already been proposed at the time of the cancellation. And even though it seems like there were other studios interested in possibly publishing the game, EA chose to not sell the publishing rights either, meaning the game was just scrapped altogether. What's even worse is that the development team that worked on Thrill Kill all the way through its whole process were not even directly informed by EA themselves that their game was getting canceled. Many found out just by reading articles and posts online or message board discussions about how the game had been canceled. And while EA tried to stop this game from getting out there, that wouldn't actually end up being the case. We don't actually know how or who specifically leaked the ROM of Thrill Kill, but I wouldn't be surprised if one day someone came out and they were like, yeah, I leaked it, I worked on the game and was kind of salty at the way that it was handled, so I posted it online. Though, we can't point fingers, we don't know who leaked it. But Thrill Kill would end up becoming one of the most popular ROMs and emulated games back in the earlier years of emulation. I mean, a game you couldn't play otherwise? That's pretty cool. And to this day, some people still hope and hold on to the possibility of Thrill Kill one day getting a release, or a remake? Remaster? I don't know what to call it. Just a release would be really cool, but it's probably unlikely. Now here's the thing, not everything would be lost for Thrill Kill though. The team at Paradox Development would use Thrill Kill as a tech demo with Activision to get the green light for a different project, Wu-Tang Shaolin Style, which would get greenlit, and the game would be developed utilizing the same engine from Thrill Kill. So this game based on Wu-Tang Clan ended up being the game that had 4 players able to fight simultaneously. The same engine would also end up being used on X-Men Mutant Academy 1 and 2 and Rock'em Sock'em Robots Arena.
Starcraft was a massive hit for Blizzard, and so it was no surprise when they announced a spin-off game called Starcraft Ghost in 2002. This game was gonna be a third-person stealth action game focused on Nova Terra, a psychic ghost operative from the Starcraft universe. It was intended to release on PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube, bringing the Starcraft franchise to consoles. It would have told the full backstory of Nova and her secret missions, and would have kinda laid the groundwork for more of the Starcraft universe to be revealed through video games. The stealth gameplay had some, RTS-inspired elements, and it was kind of cool to see these environments that you know from this RTS game in a third-person form and just kind of explore the Starcraft universe. Now, development for this game was actually struggling, and technical limitations were making it hard to keep up the high standard that Blizzard had at the time. There was also some issues with the external studios that were supposed to help on this game, so overall, they ended up making the decision to cancel this project in 2006 and shift focus onto other projects like World of Warcraft. For a long time, this game was lost until a development build for Xbox leaked in 2020. While this development build is kind of an early version and has very basic gameplay, some early levels, and incomplete assets, it's still playable on a modded Xbox or emulators. And while this game was cancelled, Nova would become a prominent character in StarCraft 2 and its DLC. And obviously there's a lot of people who consider StarCraft 2 to be one of the greatest games ever made. And StarCraft Ghost is kind of acknowledged by Blizzard every now and then, but obviously we'll probably never see it release. And I don't know, it's been 20 years almost since the cancellation. So besides these leaked development builds, we'll probably never be able to play this stealth game that looked really promising.
One thing that's really interesting is that right after we did our big 3-hour video on cut Call of Duty content, we actually found that there was a new leak made of a Call of Duty build for a canceled game known as Future Warfare that was developed by Neversoft. And what's interesting is that this build actually was really far along. Not only was this Call of Duty game in development for about a year, but in total, after some modifications were made to this, state of development build, there is about an hour and 10 minutes or so of playable gameplay, which for a Call of Duty campaign, that's pretty impressive. Not only is the content really cool to finally get a look at all of this time later, but it does beg the question, what happened here? Why was the decision made to scrap this game, and what could have been of the rest of this game? And that is a mystery in itself. The narrative is still pretty loose. We don't know too much as to what's going on in the story with what is playable because a lot of gaps hadn't been filled in yet, but there were a lot of things going on and a lot of characters starting to be introduced, characters that names would maybe be reused in games like Call of Duty Ghosts later on, and overall it's just an interesting situation. We'll briefly go through all the levels here, but we don't want to waste too much of your time. Interestingly enough, the first level actually takes place at the American-Mexican border, and despite the fact that this game is called Future Warfare, it seems heavily rooted in modern combat. Is it suggested here that maybe there was plans to shift around in time pieces, kind of like how Black Ops 2 did, and part of the game would have taken place closer to modern day? It's difficult to tell. Now, Future Warfare does use Modern Warfare 2 as a fork, and the Modern Warfare 2 to Modern Warfare 3 build was originally what Neversoft was given to work on and kind of reverse engineer a new campaign out of that. So there are a lot of placeholders and HUD and whatnot that looks like Modern Warfare 2, but this was its own game, believe it or not. The next level is called Visiting Hours, and it takes place in a hospital, and we play as some character named John Walker, and you have to essentially make your way through this hospital area with some other soldier named Baker, and it's a weird level. And actually, as I was doing a playthrough of it, just like showing a friend the build, he actually pointed out that the interior was very familiar, and he was right. Actually, the interior for this hospital is the same interior from the second level of the Modern Warfare 2 campaign, where you fight your way through the school. Now, you're not necessarily going in the exact order that you go through the school, but the geometry is the same. So it is possible that they just reused the interior to kind of build a different scenario here, and it actually worked because it's not too noticeable unless you're like randomly really familiar with hallways in Modern Warfare 2, which of course my friend I was talking to was. So yeah, we did find that one out. The level definitely ends in a pretty dramatic way, which this is probably the main crux of the entire mystery as to what the hell's going on with this campaign, because like, why does this scene happen?
Negative copy, Overlord. Repeat last. Understood. We're done here. Let's move.
After that level, there's this other modern level where you're going through like the city streets here. We're apparently in Jakarta, Indonesia, so it does look like things are moving all over the place. Note that the time at the beginning of the level doesn't give us too much info as to when this takes place. Also, where we're waking up, we don't really know why we're in this situation. The last level didn't end like that, so something must have happened. After making our way through the streets, we were then transported to a futuristic mission where I don't know what's going on. We're on some train tracks, there's like other trains moving, and you're like fighting back and forth. This level kept crashing on me, and there were some like patches that some modders made to let the level fully run, but I wasn't able to get them running myself. So fortunately, Forward Leaks uploaded footage of this canceled gameplay. We get a little bit of a better look at what one of the future levels would have looked like here. After the train section, there is some interesting dialogue over by this elevator, and they're talking about why the nukes hadn't been handed over to the snakes.
Why hasn't he handed that nuke over to the snakes? What have you been waiting for?
What is the story? I'm so curious.
Walker, we finally caught up with you. Traitor! I'm the f***ing snake. You wasted Grip. You betrayed your brothers, your country, everything!
I think we're on the moon or something. There's some space things happening and some cool polish cutscene type things, or first-person moments. Then there's this really cool level that takes place in maybe futuristic LA, and there's a parachuting sequence, and there's like a lot of fighting happening on the streets, and it's a really, really cool set piece, though the level might not be as polished as some of the other levels. There's some pretty cool futuristic looking vehicles and whatnot, and I don't know, I like this one. The next level, we're back in space in a pretty chaotic incident where kind of, I think it's hitting the fan a bit, and we just like see a lot of things. We almost die a few times. We get to use some other futuristic guns on the moon, and it's pretty cool. I think there was supposed to be like towards the end of this level maybe a bit of a dramatic moment where some sort of main character dies, but we don't really know the characters too well, so we don't know like the weight of that. Then we're back on the ground in a vehicle of some sort, just kind of going for a little car ride, because why not? The characters definitely don't work in the vehicle the way that they're supposed to yet. There are some weird moments where the characters like glitching out, but it is interesting to look at. Then there's this other level that was pretty rough around the edges. It's like a skyscraper walk or whatever, and they like are on the outside of the building, and its animations definitely aren't intact yet, so there's a lot of like nuanced weird moments like climbing through the windows or trying to keep their balance, but the animation for them keeping their balance bounce isn't there yet, so they're just like awkwardly sliding around. It's pretty goofy, but it does give kind of some interesting insight to what goes into a level, like while they're obviously developing things first before later, animations and polish goes into a level. And I don't know, I think that these are just as interesting as more polished levels we never got to play. As you get closer to the end of what is playable in this game, you can start to tell that development was pretty much at its limit before the game was canceled. They still had a ways to go, and you can see the detail on the levels start to become less and less. The way that the levels operate are less fluid and still kind of clunky, I guess, in like the way that mission progressions work and how the AI move and whatnot. And yeah, the level obviously wasn't done. The game wasn't in a ready to ship form, but it wasn't not worked on either. There was a lot put into this game, and we really only look at the campaign part here, but besides just this interesting stuff, there's like the whole multiplayer side of things. There was like a cut series of new multiplayer maps. One of them was a remake of Showdown from COD 4, and man, it just really irks me that we never got to see this game. I think that with how much time the game was in development, it would have been really cool to see something like this released before we got Ghosts or before we got Advanced Warfare by a different studio, because at its core, because it's built off of Modern Warfare 2's engine, it really does feel like a classic Call of Duty experience, but just completely different. And even though these were, a new studio working on the game, I think it could have been a cool thing to see. Ultimately, the game ended up getting canceled, and we still don't know any details about it outside of the levels that we can see and try to put together based on the placeholder audio available as to maybe what was going on with the story. But yeah, the story was still really vague, and I feel like one day it'd be really cool to see what the story would have been like. Maybe modders one day will pick up the project and finish it. I doubt it, but wouldn't that be so cool? Probably not, though. Nonetheless, RIP NX Future Warfare. I think you would have been a cool experience at the very least.
Nowadays, Warcraft with World of Warcraft is a massive franchise, and there's millions of players still playing it. And I mean, Warcraft 3 was incredibly popular too and spawned things like Dota or, its own little community that would play the game even nowadays. But way before World of Warcraft and before Warcraft 3, there was supposed to be a point-and-click adventure game set in the Warcraft universe, and that game was called Warcraft Adventures: Lord of the Clans. This game focused on the story of Thrall, like, the orc who's like a key figure in the Warcraft lore. I don't know if you've seen the movie or you know anything about the Warcraft lore, you might know this guy, but people who don't, I don't know, he's just like an important orc. Like, I don't know, he's just like the leader, or like, I don't know, he reunited them. Nonetheless, this game was developed in the late 90s and was cancelled because of quality concerns. And I think like they were kind of worried about the story of Thrall not being captivating enough, because this did focus highly on his backstory, like on his journey, how he was like an orphan child, and then how he became the leader of the orcs, and you know what I mean? All those things would have been part of the game, and all those themes would have showed up. And it would have set up the stage for the events of Warcraft 3, which was the game that released next in the Warcraft series. Just looks like a classic point-and-click adventure from the 90s. It's like the traditional 2D point-and-click adventure with like puzzles and dialogue and storytelling, much like, Day of the Tentacle or Monkey Island, stuff like that. It had the pre-rendered graphics, character animation, and full voice acting. But even with all that, Blizzard just didn't feel like it met their high quality standards, which, I mean, there was a time where Blizzard did have really high quality standards for their games, and every Blizzard game releasing was a certified banger for a while. So they felt like this game was just like too small and maybe too simplistic. It didn't push any boundaries, it was just a point and click adventure. And even though it was almost finished, the decision was made to cancel this game. But when fans learned of the cancellation back in the 90s, they were actually trying to get Blizzard to end up releasing it, because there was people who were interested in this, and there was a petition that was started in August 1998, and they received like 1,700 signatures, and they would send that to Blizzard, to which Blizzard would respond with the following. It was a hard call to make, but each of us knows that this was the right choice. The cancellation was not a business or marketing decision or even a statement about the adventure genre. The decision centered around the level of value that we want to give our customers. In essence, it was a case of stepping up and really proving to ourselves and gamers that we will not sell out on the quality of our games. So you can tell with the statement they felt very strongly about this game just not being high enough quality for their fans. And this would leave some internal rifts at Blizzard as well. There was a couple of developers who did specifically leave because of the cancellation of this game. They just felt like it was unfair with how far along the game was, and that the cancellation just came out of nowhere. So there was people who were pretty upset that worked on this game. And I mean, rightfully so. They put their heart and soul into this, and they just canceled it. But after that, people just kind of forgot about this canceled game, and nobody really raised an eye anymore at the cancellation direction after a couple of years, because Blizzard would keep releasing good games. But around 2010, different versions and video footage of this game started leaking online. At first, there was like a short gameplay alpha that showed the game, then someone uploaded a longer play of the beta version in 2011, and then in 2016, the full game was leaked, including cutscenes and everything. And I mean, obviously, this is pretty illegal to leak this, and I mean, Blizzard would try to take action, but I mean, once something has been uploaded and shared on the internet, it's really hard to get rid of it. So from that moment on, this full game was out there. And what's actually interesting about this is that people would review the full version of the game after it was leaked, and a lot of reviewers were like, you know, this game is okay, but nothing that was super good. And I mean, I guess that means Blizzard was right in canceling the game. It really wouldn't have been an amazing game like all their other lineups at the time. Now, this game does have a big legacy if you think about it, because first of all, there was a book based on this game that was released in 2001, so I guess the plot elements were reused for the book, but also the character Thrall is an integral part to World of Warcraft lore. And as I mentioned earlier, he's also featured in the movie, so he's like an integral part, and this would have been his backstory. So I do find it interesting that a lot of the ideas and themes were recycled over the years and brought back. So they might not want you to play this game, but you know, in parts it's still there, even if you don't go download the leaked version.
Let's talk about a game that neither Nintendo nor North Korea wants you playing. You see, interestingly enough, I was watching a video by Half As Interesting talking about the smartphone that they only have in North Korea. And one thing that's fascinating is that there was a study done on phones that had somehow been brought out of North Korea. You know, just take a closer look and get an idea of what's going on there. Now, North Korea itself is interesting as they don't have human rights or internet, just this like interconnected network that's exclusive and closed off to North Korea. But the phones that released through North Korea that people can use not only are just knockoffs of Chinese smartphones, but also they have some interesting apps. In that video that Half As Interesting did, they show that there is a Mario Galaxy app available on these smartphones. And I was really disappointed that there wasn't like a deeper dive into what this game is. I've tried to do research online to see any more details other than the fact that this Mario Galaxy game exists. Now, I get that there's a bunch of other bootlegged apps on these phones. That's no real surprise to me, but I'm just curious, like, what is this? Is this an emulator running Super Mario Galaxy for the Wii? Is this like an older Mario game that's just branded with like the Mario Galaxy icon? This is actually somewhat of a mystery, but I definitely don't feel like North Korea wants people outside of their country playing this game to see that it's just like a bootleg game. I don't think they want their public knowing that they don't even manufacture the phones. They did this whole thing where they're like, look, we're manufacturing our own phones, you know, for North Koreans to see. But we obviously know the technology is not coming out of North Korea, that's for sure. Neither is this Mario game being developed by North Korean engineers. Unfortunately, I don't know what game it is. I feel like it's probably either Mario Run retrofitted into some sort of form that can play on these types of smartphones or whatever, or it could just be like Super Mario on the NES with a emulation or something. But I don't know. I was just really curious about that, and I felt like, you know, this should count. I feel like Nintendo probably doesn't want this game existing. Also, it's worth pointing out that if you want to go and get more apps on these North Korean phones, you have to go to a physical app store. There's no like digital app store where you can download apps. So who knows what other games are available if you go to one of these real locations to upload games or apps to your phone based on your needs. I just think that's something a little goofy. Should I have included this one in the video? Someone comment and let me know if you thought that this was a topic that was worth including or if I should have cut it. I need feedback for what to pick in these videos anyways. Before Fallout 3 existed, there was development on a Fallout 3 that would have brought things to the 3D world earlier than what actually ended up happening with Fallout 3. This sounds confusing, but originally, developer Black Isle Studios was working with Interplay Entertainment with the goal to make a Fallout 3 game that would utilize 3D visuals and first-person modes and build out the lore even more. The publisher really wanted Black Isle Studios to make the game move into a real-time combat mode rather than the, you know, turn-based stuff that Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 had, but the game would still have elements of turn-based play and even a cooperative mode that was planned for its inclusion. Honestly, while this game never got very far along, originally only being set up to have an 18-month development cycle, there were a lot of things that were planned for it. Like the game would have taken place in, you know, the American Southwest, but ultimately on December 8th, despite the fact that the game was moving along in development, the game would end up being canceled due to financial difficulties coming from Interplay Entertainment, the publisher for the game. And what's interesting is while most people forget about the Van Buren Fallout 3, which is what we're talking about here, because Fallout 3 would overshadow it. There was a playable demo that would eventually release in 2007. This game would have put players in the United States of America during the Great War, and the player character would travel to the relocation center and be escorted to Vault 1 while fighting their way against communist insurgents. This, in a way, would be kind of like a early prequel type game to the Fallout experiences and stories that are told in the Bethesda era Fallout games, so it could have been something really cool. Now, of course, with the Fallout IP still being popular, even if this other project fell apart, Bethesda would swoop in and acquire the rights to Fallout and would go on to make Fallout 3. They would commission Fallout New Vegas to release, and then also do Fallout 4 and Fallout 76. And while Fallout's popularity is now bigger than ever, it's still interesting to see this tech demo that you can still go on and play now that, was straight up advertised as Fallout 3. I mean, look, it's right there on the words. Look, see, Fallout 3. But ultimately, it wouldn't end up officially releasing. And Bethesda probably won't ever revisit this again. So this is what we got, the Van Buren tech demo. And I think that ultimately is kind of cool. So this next game is actually really, really weird that I had to get Luke in a call just specifically to go over my findings because it is incredibly fascinating. So I was doing research, right? And have you ever seen the commercials, like those Raisin commercials from the 90s or so?
Yeah, it's like the dancing raisins, right? One of them has like an Elvis haircut maybe sometimes.
Maybe. So long story short, if either you don't know or the people watching this don't know, California Raisins had this like grape advertisement commercial that was like incredibly popular for some reason in the 80s and 90s. And long story short, they started out by using the characters, and then they would sing, and then they were like a boy band, and then they released like 4 albums with different record labels.
4 albums?
Yeah, like this was like a legitimate thing, and like they did a commercial with Michael Jackson.
Maybe that's what I remember. Yeah, maybe the Michael Jackson one. One of them has like a weird haircut or something.
Okay, but what's weird about it is that these things were like super, super popular, I guess, or from a marketing standpoint, it was like doing really well. So long story short, there were like spin-offs coming out of it. They had like a television series, like an animated series that had like a season before it was canceled. And during the late 80s, there was like a lot of merchandising going into the mascot characters of the raisins. I mean, they were also promoting like the Raisin Company, so you can like buy raisins and eat them. But for the most part, it was like becoming its own thing. Now, a couple of interesting things came from this, like a video game called the California Raisins Grape Escape, which ended up getting canceled, though the game was mostly finished. When I was looking into it, the reasoning for it getting canceled opened up a whole nother rabbit hole. So I'm just gonna like read this verbatim off of, I think, Wikipedia, right? The game was canceled due to the California Raisins' dwindling popularity because of the downfall sales of raisins in the late 1980s and early 1900s. Or sorry, early 1990s. So like it was like the raisin crash of the late 80s and 90s that caused this game to get canceled. Not anything related to the video game industry.
You know how that's the retail apocalypse? This was the Raisin apocalypse.
Right. I don't know what happened, why people stopped buying raisins. Why? I mean, I don't know. Apparently they were a really popular snack until they weren't. Even more interestingly, though, the game was probably at the point where it was finished because there were publications with the game, like the Game Player's Encyclopedia of Nintendo Games Volume 3 had hints for the game itself that never released in it. And there were flyers with upcoming Capcom NES games that also included this as like a listing for an upcoming game to look out for. But the lore is even more interesting because then I was like, well, why did the Raisin market crash? Or why did like the Sun-Made and California Raisin thing stop being this like ongoing thing? Or at least why did they slow down in the early 90s? The death of the California Raisins, I guess, fully came though into effect like a decade after the game was canceled, which was in 2002 when there was like some big internal controversy with the California Raisin Advisory Board, which essentially had members of the grape farming industry who were growing alarmed, and this is verbatim from Wikipedia, from increased fees, which were driven by an ever-escalating amount of money being spent on the California Raisins campaign. So essentially, like, farmers were feeling like the fees for, like, marketing that gets taken out of their profits was starting to become exponentially higher, and it was likely becoming exponentially higher because of the absurd amount of money that these California Raisins were having for their production and commercials and existence altogether. So they were alleging straight up that these advertising campaigns were resulting in all of the profits from the campaign eventually funneling back to this main company, and it was like a vicious cycle of like more money, more popularity, and dwindling profits. So ultimately, the California Raisins were disbanded at that point.
Damn, dude, they broke up like NSYNC.
Yeah. With no real reunion in sight. So this game was like a mystery. It was kind of lost media for a while. And ultimately, though, it randomly would reappear with a beta cartridge of the game, which ended up being sold for about $1,000. And then it was dumped online, thus resurrecting the California Raisins Grape Escape back to life. The main purpose of the game, you'd be like playing as one of the Raisins. You go through like a side-scrolling level. There was various evil fruit and vegetables, and apparently they had stolen the music, the Raisins music, and they had to go back and get it. Yeah, it was pretty basic, but it was an NES game. It was produced by Capcom, so I don't know. It'd be interesting if it would have actually come out, but we never got to see the official release. But eventually it did end up leaking, and you can play it nowadays. But I don't know. I was very impressed looking into this. The fact that the California Raisins released 4 albums. Some of their music charted.
Do you know what number in the charts? Like number 1?
The US top 200, number 60.
Oh, it's actually pretty high out there.
I don't know why. But yeah, they did 4. They did 3 albums and a Christmas album. And that is the lore that I dove into for the California Raisins, who apparently haven't been seen since 2002. Also, mind you, like I didn't even go into all the other details because there was like a primetime television show called Meet the Raisins, which was like a mockumentary. There was, of course, the cartoon series we talked about. And there was like talks about possibly bringing them back in the future. They haven't come back yet. In 2015, it was announced that there'd be a live-action CGI reboot of the Raisins, but I don't think anything ever came into fruition with that. The Wikipedia page seems pretty outdated in regards to that, and it's not like there's a lot of other sources talking about the California Raisins nowadays. So, you know, information out there seems pretty scarce. Now, you may notice this if you've ever played like a Madden game, where it seems like EA has the market cornered when it comes to NFL football games, as EA has an exclusivity deal with the NFL. However, that's not the case when it comes to NBA, where the NBA will license themselves out to multiple different companies, which has created really interesting competition over the last decades or so, where EA will make a game, 2K has a game. Does anyone remember NBA Ballers Chosen One? So with there being more competition in the NBA side of things, EA, back in the Xbox 360 and PS3 era, was trying to reinvent their own NBA series, the NBA Live series, which would release yearly. And in 2010, they would set up to release essentially what would be seen as like the reboot of their own NBA series, this time called NBA Elite 11. The game was literally just days away from releasing. It had already gone gold. Kevin Durant was on the cover, but just a few weeks before the launch of the game, EA released a playable demo to entice more people into pre-ordering the game and buying it. Except when people downloaded the demo and played it, they realized the game, A, wasn't very good, and B, was kind of plagued with glitches and was definitely not in an acceptable or polished state. I mean, there's countless clips online of people filming these weird things that have happened to them when they were trying to play this NBA demo, and it became apparent that the game wasn't very good. I mean, there was also like the gameplay side of things just not feeling good compared to other game series out there that were just kind of doing basketball better, like 2K. So people were like, wow, this is rough for sure. And it kind of became a meme for a little while, which actually, to a surprising move, caused EA to pull the plug on the game, despite the fact that the game was literally practically at the hands of some retailers already. I'm assuming the game would be called back even if retailers already had copies that were going to go, you know, at the launch day of the game, probably through the normal recall channels for something that's not supposed to release. However, some games did manage to slip out there, and people were able to buy the game early, which is nothing new. You see this all the time whenever a game is getting close to release, where some copies of the game get sold early. Some stores will break the street date or whatever. It's not really a big surprise, but this means that the game had a very, very, very limited release. And it seems like only the PlayStation 3 version was the version that was able to leak out there, where there are copies of the game still floating around. Now, this has been one of the most interesting, like, unreleased games because it actually leaked through the cracks and has physical copies out there, not just like something that could be used in emulation or loaded up with like a modded console, which you still can do. But the fact that there's real legitimate copies out there too, it's really interesting. Now, if you look on eBay, you will see the asking price for a game like this is astronomically overpriced. I don't think anybody is actually buying the game at the prices that are listed. There's a difference between a listed price and what it actually will sell for. The people asking for these crazy dollar amounts for the game typically aren't going to see that. The game is incredibly rare, and I do think if you actually had a copy of it complete in box, you might be able to see $5,000, and that might be a high estimate. If you had it like PSA rated, maybe a little more, and if you had it like used or open, you probably could still get a couple $1,000s for it. But we're not talking about anything in like the hundreds of thousands plus range like some people think it is. Similarly, there were rare demo discs that were also produced, and those things are pretty rare as well. Not as rare. You can pick one up probably for $100 or so online, but yeah, I don't know. This game just has a really interesting legacy. They ended up not making another NBA game after this one because they canceled, this one. They did an iOS version, but besides that, they didn't do another mainline game. They took 2 years off. They announced that they were going to be doing a return with NBA Live 2013, but then they canceled that as well. And then they finally made a return with NBA Live 2014. But the story doesn't fully end there because more recently, after the 2019 game released, they decided to call it quits there, and we haven't seen an NBA Live game since then. So just an interesting arc for NBA fans everywhere. I'm not 1000% sure that this next one counts, but I just want to mention it. Glover 2 could be playable very soon. Now, Glover 1 was a classic 3D platforming game where you kind of look like the hamburger helper glove, and Glover 2 was supposed to be a follow-up game that was about 60% done. However, things could be changing very soon here, where this canceled game might finally become playable. Now, we recently did a podcast where we were talking about this, and I think I explained things a little bit better and we talked about it. So let's just cut to that real quick just for a minute. So the explanation's here. Glover, does anyone remember that game where you run around as a glove, like the hamburger helper looking mitten glove? You know what I'm talking about? Hamburger Helper has a mascot that looks like Glover.
Wait, let's see. Let's check.
We'll put them up side by side. Oh, you're going to go get Hamburger Helper. Okay. I thought we were going to do it like a edit. No. Luke is going to the kitchen. Does that look like Glover?
Yeah, look. It's Glover.
I think the face is on the wrong side. But, I mean, otherwise it'd be Glover. How many fingers does the Hamburger Helper have?
4.
Including a thumb?
Yeah. Are you saying that the thumb is not a finger now?
No, I think the thumb is a finger.
Oh, okay.
But I didn't know how, you operate. How many fingers does Glover have?
Glover also only had 4.
Maybe there's more connected here than what we initially thought.
Maybe they're related.
Like cousins. But the faces are on the other side.
Their parents are also cousins.
Wait, what else is interesting about this is that technically Pico Interactive also has the rights to the unreleased Glover 2, which they have stated that they plan to finish development on and release, which means we might eventually see Glover 2, a canceled Nintendo 64 game, release to the masses. Or probably a limited run and then a release elsewhere. But you guys get what I mean. This is interesting. Even in the unlicensed side of things, it's not like Nintendo's sitting there yep, as long as you guys buy publishing or you guys buy the rights to publish on the Nintendo 64, you guys can go ahead and do it. Nintendo's not caring about the Nintendo 64 to that extent now. But it is very interesting when stuff like this does pop up. I always thought the original Resident Evil game was a piece of its time, I guess.
This is the ultimate life form. Tyrant. Chris? Stop it.
I mean, let's be honest. The original PlayStation 1 version by today's standards, probably not the best looking game ever. And they would, overhaul things later in the next generation, tidying things up again, making things look great. But there was a Game Boy Color version planned at one point. Let's just take that PlayStation 1 version and dial it back even more. So this one's interesting. There was a Game Boy Color version of Resident Evil that was developed by a small team known as Hot Gen. It was supposed to be released in 1999 or maybe early 2000, but Capcom decided decided to cancel the project because the prototypes that they had of the game to see how far along the game had progressed wasn't really the best quality because the Game Boy was really limited in hardware. But you know what? This game was actually really ambitious to try to condense a game that was a main console game with what is available on an original Game Boy Color. It's pretty insane to say the least. Matter of fact, this build of the game had every single room, there were cutscenes, and a lot of features that were present in the PlayStation version set up to be in this Game Boy Color version, despite it looking, like this. So unfortunately, this game would get scrapped. Eventually, Resident Evil Gaiden would release, making its way onto the handheld game market through Nintendo. But this original version was kind of a piece of lost media almost, until 2012, when a user claimed to have the EEPROM developmental cartridge of the Game Boy Color version. And what's interesting is that the person who had this cartridge somehow probably could have just asked for an astronomically high price online and just sell it off. And while we don't know all of the details of who the person who had this copy of the game really was, it's been speculated that this mystery person was a collector, came across the game somehow or this build and paid a very high dollar amount to get his hands on it. And instead of just turning around and selling it online, he wanted to make sure that the game would be preserved. So they connected with a different user on the assembler forums, and the user on the forums was able to arrange a fundraiser for the buyer who had purchased this build of Resident Evil that actually contained 2 different cartridge builds of the game. And instead of selling the game off to some random collector who would have to then fork up a bunch of money just to archive the game or to just keep it for themselves, the buyer agreed that if $2,000 were raised, he would just dump the ROM and everybody would be able to access it, which would be raised in just a couple of days. And you know what? He actually kept his side of the deal, surprisingly, and after the $2,000 was raised, he dropped the 2 different builds of Resident Evil for the Game Boy Color, and people were able to explore what this game was like. And honestly, it was really ambitious. I'm really impressed for a Game Boy Color game that they were able to recreate so many scenes from the original Resident Evil game. Sure, it looks like you're watching cells through a microscope or something, but that was how the Game Boy Color was back in the day, and it was really impressive. And also way further along and further developed than I think anybody had anticipated. Nonetheless, despite this game getting canceled, Capcom would release Resident Evil Gaiden, who they partnered up with developers M4 to make, which was a little bit of a different style, and it was its own thing with a top-down perspective, and it was okay. You got 5 to 7 out of 10s back in the day, and it probably plays a little worse nowadays, but you guys get what I'm saying. It's still cool to see this OG game finally released after $2,000 released.
Mario Kart XXL is another title that fits on this list because it was a tech demo created by Donaris Entertainment, and it was never supposed to be played by anyone outside of Nintendo. It was a super short tech demo that had one level that showcased how Mario Kart could run on the Game Boy Advance. And for a long time, people didn't even know about this tech demo that was created around 2004. So it was kind of a surprise when people would eventually discover this ROM and post it online for anyone to go play it. And to explain further why this was created in the first place, it wasn't supposed to be a Mario Kart game. They were just trying to show off what they could do when developing Game Boy Advance games. So they're just pitching this as an example to Nintendo. So then Nintendo would go, oh, they're actually capable of making games and maybe we'll hire them or something. And this is an interesting case because usually, there's copyright infringement with ROMs, but this is kind of a double copyright infringement because first of all, when they made this tech demo, they obviously didn't have any rights to any of the Nintendo IP, and they just reused Mario Kart circuit assets to make this tech demo, which is fine because, it wasn't supposed to release commercially. So this ROM kind of infringes on, Nintendo's rights twice in a way. I don't know if that's a good way to put it, but I'm still very glad that it is out there and we do know of it because, I don't know, I just think this is an interesting thing, much like the Halo DS thing.
Another Call of Duty game that would never be released would enter development, one of which we never even knew existed prior to the leak coming out. That's Call of Duty Phantoms for the Xbox 360. Now, this isn't a full-on deleted or canceled Call of Duty game. Matter of fact, this was actually Sledgehammer Games' little passion project that they were working on before development full force started on Call of Duty Advanced Warfare. Call of Duty Phantom was actually a fork of the then in progress Call of Duty Ghosts, which it itself was built off of Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 and essentially was used strictly for prototyping ideas for Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, knowing good and well that once the engine that Advanced Warfare was finished being developed, development would be shifted shifted over to this new engine. Advanced Warfare was a bit interesting. That game used its own engine that still had like similarities to older Call of Duty games, but for the most part, it was its own unique build, one that would exclusively exist for Advanced Warfare. So here we are with this prototype version of Call of Duty Advanced Warfare that a lot of people didn't know existed, and we have just more questions now than ever before. This is the build called Call of Duty Phantom. Now, this build doesn't have a whole lot playable, as most of the development probably wasn't done on this build for Advanced Warfare, but there are some interesting things to note, like it uses Modern Warfare 3's UI and a lot of assets from Modern Warfare 3, and there are some leftover weapons, but all the menus and stuff actually reflect the Advanced Warfare aesthetic, so it's very, very possible that this might have just been more of like a UI main menu prototype that they're just kind of testing out ideas for the feel of Advanced Warfare. Now, the campaign menu includes placeholders for things like blacksmith levels, which was a code name, I guess, and then there's some legacy levels that contain references to Modern Warfare 3 missions. There are the Spec Ops tab and multiplayer mode tab, but they're actually non-functional and they'll just crash, and they have like missing assets and stuff. And then this build has one playable mission, which is titled Fusion. It doesn't have any cutscenes or anything like that, and it starts out with just gameplay pretty much. And while this level is unfinished, it does have a lot of similarities to the final version that we saw in Advanced Warfare, which is kind of interesting to see an alternate version from a different build of a level that already exists, kind of. Ultimately, not a whole lot of substance to this build, but it does beg the question as to why they opted for going this route to begin with, and focuses in more on why did they do a separate engine just for Advanced Warfare? Were they that sure that Advanced Warfare 2 would come out and they would need to continue building off of the same engine into the future? I mean, future Call of Duty games made by Sledgehammer Games wouldn't always utilize a brand new, unique engine. As we know, more recently, Modern Warfare 3, which was led by Sledgehammer Games, was done completely in pretty much the same engine that Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 was built in, and that was probably a fork of Call of Duty 2019. It was also forked off for Vanguard, so it is interesting. Now there's really just like two main Call of Duty engines that we see being used, which is like the Treyarch one and then the Infinity Ward one. But yeah, I don't know, maybe they were trying to do like a third engine, which might seem redundant with now how often all of these studios are collaborating on projects. You know, it's honestly kind of rare for Nintendo to have games that wouldn't release that then would go on to be playable, but there are a few interesting examples of this. For instance, Starfox 2. You see, the first ever Starfox game was revolutionary for the Super Nintendo because it had all these like cool polygons. It was like 3D before 3D was like a normal thing. It had like a Super FX chip. There was like a whole big deal about it. And there were plans to like make a follow-up game that was pretty innovative and bigger than everything they did in the first game. The game was greenlit and developed by Nintendo EAD, but during the development of Starfox 2, the 3D gaming space was evolving really quickly, faster than what a Super Nintendo could keep up with, and by 1995, there was a PlayStation, a Sega Saturn. Starfox 2, which was being developed, would still be technically working with just 16-bit graphics. Now, the game was mostly finished by 1995, and Nintendo decided to pull the plug rather than releasing a game that would make the overall Nintendo brand look like it was falling behind. A lot of the ideas of this game would end up being implemented in Star Fox 64, which would be the successor, the next Star Fox game, which would launch on Nintendo 64 and was kind of an awesome game. I really enjoyed this game. It was one of my first video games I ever played, and I still jump on and give it a go every once in a while. But man, for a game that was kind of hyped up a bit like Star Fox 2, it was sad to see a game that was very innovative for the series get scrapped and tossed out the door altogether. Like, this game was hyped. Matter of fact, they showed off the game at Winter CES in January of 1995, and some guy tried to steal the promotional cartridge with Star Fox 2 on it, and he was arrested and charged with felony grand larceny. Ultimately, though, specifically with a game like Ridge Racer releasing the same year, Nintendo didn't want to take Star Fox 2 up against it, and despite Nintendo pulling the plug on the game, since the game was so close to finished, they still went ahead and finished up the localization and QA testing phases that they already had planned for it, you know, just to finish it up and put it in the Nintendo vault, I guess. Star Fox 2 would have been pretty cool, though. The game had different vehicles, like a walker version of the R-Wing. Star Wolf, which becomes like a major character in Star Fox 64, was originally to be introduced. You'd be able to play as different characters besides just Fox, something that wouldn't come to the series until like Star Fox Command. But this game would become notorious for one of the few examples of a Nintendo game that was finished but canceled. But that didn't mean the game would go unplayable. Shortly after the game's original release window, ROM images of various builds of Star Fox 2 would end up getting leaked onto the internet in the late 90s. One of the lead developers, Dylan Cuthbert, would deny that he ever leaked the suspected ROMs, but did question whether or not an anonymous leaker who had taken his hard drive after he left the company Argonaut, who was working on Star Fox 2, went on to leak the game from there. The early builds of Star Fox 2 that were leaked in the late 90s were early test builds, and there was a lot of issues with them. But a few years later, an anonymous person would actually reach out to members in the emulation community, stating that they had managed to secure a non-working copy of the final beta ROM, the most complete version of the game. They just couldn't get it running. So some of the emulation community were able to figure out one of the errors that was causing the game not to run, and they got it functioning. This ROM would end up getting leaked after, and while it was just the Japanese version of the game, it was much more complete than previous versions. It was pretty far along, probably 95% done. There were a few features that didn't work completely properly, but for the most part, you could sit there and see the entire Star Fox 2 game. So at the very least, for years, players were able to try out Star Fox 2 and, see what it was like, even if the game wasn't 100% functioning the way it would have in retail, because it was technically running through like a debug system. But people thought for the most part, that would be that. In 2016, Star Fox Zero would release, which incorporated even more elements from the canceled Star Fox 2. But all of a sudden in 2017, things would change as Nintendo released the Super NES Classic, which was a kind of a lifesaver era, the NES Classic and Super NES Classic, that both sold incredibly well and helped Nintendo during the dark ages of the Wii U. But the idea to include Star Fox 2 for one of the games in the Super NES Classic was pitched, as Nintendo thought it'd be a waste to never release a completed and fully debugged game. And since Nintendo had preserved the game since its completion, it wouldn't be very hard to get it running on the Super NES Classic. So finally, when the Super NES Classic Edition released, finally Star Fox 2 saw a real retail release by Nintendo, even if it was, like 22 years after it was originally supposed to release. I think this is really cool. And the team that worked on Star Fox 2, I guess, had a little get together, or some of the members of the team who worked on Star Fox 2, and kind of celebrated the launch of their game decades later, and I think that's pretty cool. Star Fox 2 would also later be included in the Nintendo Switch Online service, meaning that Star Fox 2 is kind of now included as a piece of Nintendo's portfolio that they just are proud of. And there's a localized version. You can play the game the way it was intended. So if you ever get a chance to play Star Fox 2, definitely give it a try, just so you can kind of play something that so many people wondered about for decades. I remember as a little kid reading up on forums about Star Fox 2 and wondering what that game was. I mean, look at Wolf. He looked so different in Star Fox 2. He had two eyes. Nonetheless, a cool story from the Nintendo side of things. Another interesting arc in the whole Nintendo's games that people weren't supposed to play saga here was Pokemon Gold and Silver. Now, we of course saw Pokemon Gold and Silver eventually release, but these games were originally supposed to come out a couple of years earlier. I mean, if you remember back, Pokemon Gold and Silver was originally shown off at 1997's Nintendo Space World event in Japan, and was even teased in the first episode of the Pokemon anime. This was something that was supposed to come out relatively soon. Matter of fact, Gold and Silver was supposed to release in 1998, synchronizing the end of the anime's first season with the release of the new Pokemon game. But ultimately, the game would end up getting delayed more, refined, and changed quite a bit before the release of Pokemon Gold and Silver in 1999 in Japan, in 2000 in North America and Australia, 2001 in Europe, and 2002 in Korea. But here's the thing, the game that released was actually substantially different than what was first shown off for Pokemon Gold and Silver at that Space World event in 1997. For a very long time, documentation of what happened in the demo in the 1997 version of Pokemon Gold and Silver was limited, but we knew some things were different. Starters were slightly different, some more slight than others. A lot of the sprite palettes seemed to be reusing stuff from Pokemon Red and Green, and other than just speculation from concept art or interviews over the years, there wasn't too much known about what was going on with that early demo version of the game until 2018, when everything would be leaked, including the demo that was shown on the expo floor back in 1997, which showed quite a bit off that was different from the retail release of Pokemon Gold and Silver. This would be a massive starting point, as not only players could go through the files and see what was out there, but they could actually experience the game in this limited demo state, and that was pretty cool in itself. This would be the starting point for a ton of of other leaks and builds of Pokemon Gold and Silver that date back from around this time, even if they weren't from specifically the Space World event, that shows a lot of other iterations and a lot of cut Pokemon that never ended up getting to happen, or alternate designs. It's wild. Some of the Pokemon look really unique and different. Some of these ideas would be scrapped for this game but used in later games, and some of the Pokemon look like Digimon, specifically these guys here, like the in-training level Digimon, the ones before they like turn into like the rookie levels that we would see in the show. I mean, this guy was the fire starter, right? Before he was replaced with Cyndaquil, and he looked pretty cool. I don't know what happened in the middle of Chikorita's evolution line, but I'm just gonna let that one go. And we really got robbed with Politoad's design, because Politoad originally looked way closer to like the regular Poliwag, Poliwhirl, Poliwrath line, but you know, more frog-like. I don't know what happened though. I prefer the old one. This is really just the tip of the iceberg. It's a really interesting deep dive if you ever wanted to look into more things about Pokemon, because a lot of the stuff would change with multiple iterations. But yeah, check out the cutting room floor for sure, because there's quite a bit you can look into and it's pretty cool. Yo, look at Kingdra though. Okay, I'm not gonna go on more about this stuff. I know not everyone here is a Pokemon fan, but I don't know, this stuff is just really cool to me. Yo, is that what baby Pikachu originally looked like? Was Cyndaquil originally not even a fire type? There's even a baby Meowth and maybe a baby Growlithe. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm done. We're moving on for now. For the longest time, Duke Nukem Forever was a game that was notoriously known for having the longest development ever. Now that crown has been passed along to Beyond Good and Evil 2 by Ubisoft, but back in the day, people had been waiting for Duke Nukem Forever literally forever. You see, back in 1996, Duke Nukem 3D would release, and people really liked it because it was like humorous, it was interactive, it was cool. It sold like 3.5 million copies. So of course, that was good. People wanted to see more Duke Nukem, and Duke Nukem Forever would be announced in 1997, which had a planned release of 1998. Except that never happened. This game would be plagued by a lot of development issues. Initially, the game was being built on the Quake 2 engine, but then it would later switch to the Unreal Engine, which meant the whole project had to be restarted. In 1999, they ended up switching again to a newer version of the Unreal Engine, which delayed the game further. It seemed like in 2000, the game was suffering from chaotic management and maybe not a clear vision on what this game was actually supposed to be. And since 3D Realms, the developer of the game, was self-funding the game based off of the revenue earned from Duke Nukem 3D themselves, it meant that they didn't have a publisher necessarily pushing them, you know, to get the game done in a timely manner, but it also meant that all financial pressures would fall under the studio itself to keep itself afloat. By 2001, though, the game was still not coming around, and I think there was a lot of memes in the gaming community that Duke Nukem Forever didn't even exist. It was just something that was announced that wasn't even a real thing. Now, they did show off another teaser trailer in 2001, and apparently development stalled even more after this. There was some understaffing issues. They had 18 full-time developers as of 2003, and I guess at one point the studio even tried to bring in external studios to help them. They worked with Digital Extremes for a little while in 2004, but that didn't work out either. But man, where is this game that they've been working on for years at this point? It seemed like a lot of issues internally would culminate in 2006 when development would be restarted yet again. Any progress after that was pretty slow. There was a large turnover rate as staff was frustrated with the progress that this game was making, and half of the team ended up leaving in 2006. I guess even with a game as successful as Duke Nukem 3D, you can only live off of the revenue for so long, and finally, by 2009, 3D Realms had run out of funding, so they ended up laying off the rest of the team and halting development. This is when things would actually see a turn for the better, where in 2010, Gearbox would acquire 3D Realms, and they would incorporate former 3D Realm developers back into the whole mix, and finally, an actual game would be developed and made. And the game would release in 2011, 15 years after it was originally announced, and technically still holds the record for the longest game development for a game that has ever released. But what's interesting is while there were all of these different development periods for this game, people never thought we would get a glimpse at what was cooking behind the scenes back in the earlier days of development before the whole Gearbox acquisition. But in May of 2022, an unfinished version of Duke Nukem Forever, a build dating back from 2001 would end up leaking online, meaning any player would be able to essentially play this unfinished version of Duke Nukem Forever to see what the game's original aspirations were. Not only did the game leak itself, but the entire source code and level editor ended up leaking as well during this time. And while you can now play a little bit of Duke Nukem Forever, it's very clear that this game was still very, very early in production by the time this build was made, as ultimately there's not a whole lot going on, but for what there is, there's some interesting things, like the gunfights were kind of cool, and I mean, it's just kind of cool that we're even getting to see this at all. Now, what's even more interesting is that there is also a version of Duke Nukem Forever that was supposed to be a 2D game that had a build from 1996, and that build would end up getting leaked after this other build was leaked. And I mean, look at this. It's more Duke Nukem. Now, one thing that is interesting is there's a fan mod now called the Duke Nukem Forever Restoration Project, which aims to clean up and finish up and polish up the state of that 3D version of Duke Nukem Forever from 2001 and put it in at least somewhat of a more complete and playable state, so people could go and take a look at it and see what this game was like, since you know, the development would restart so many times. Duke Nukem Forever released in 2011, and it was fine. You know, I think critics were way too hard on it because I think ultimately the game was kind of cool. It was just the fact that the game had so much anticipation for years and years and years, and the game never coming out. It just meant that the bar was probably just way too high for what the game would end up realistically being. Nonetheless, Duke Nukem Forever on the Xbox 360 and PS3 or whatever is definitely not the same Duke Nukem experience that fans expected back in the 90s and early 2000s. And, you know, it's cool to look back and see what could have been or what would have been had development moved along a little bit smoother than what it actually ended up having, and maybe things could have come together. Who knows? Surprisingly enough, there was an Elder Scrolls game in development for the PlayStation Portable called The Elder Scrolls Travels Oblivion, which would have been a PSP spinoff of Oblivion, but still like based, you know, in the world of Elder Scrolls and Oblivion, but it would have been portable. Now, of course, the Elder Scrolls series has seen many, many spinoffs over the years, some better than others, some obscure, some weird, and the Elder Scrolls Travels tagline was something that already existed, as they had been making these like little spinoff mobile games on the go or whatever, and with the Elder Scrolls stuff. So this Oblivion one was supposed to be a really big deal, and Bethesda teamed up with Climax LA to develop a game, but ultimately the game would end up getting canceled sometime around summer of 2007. I guess ultimately ZeniMax and Bethesda felt that this game probably wouldn't make a big difference in profitability for the company as a whole, and it probably wasn't necessary to go through the efforts of making an expensive PlayStation Portable game, so everything ended up getting scrapped. And honestly, this is a big mystery or almost a piece of lost media in the Elder Scrolls community for a long time, until 2016, when a YouTube channel known as Past to Present Online actually managed to upload footage of the game, as the owner of the channel managed to get their hands on an early demo build of the game, though the sources on how they acquired it were anonymous. So ultimately, we got to see gameplay or footage of this game for the first time ever. However, in 2016 also, right after the videos would go live, ZeniMax would end up hitting the channel with copyright strikes, which forced the video's removal. The results of this was definitely not what ZeniMax probably anticipated or expected, but someone else out there who had access to the builds of the game then leaked multiple tests and demo builds of the game onto various websites and archival websites, which not only included the same builds that the YouTuber Past to Present Online had access to, but also other builds that nobody had ever seen before. I guess someone out there who had these builds didn't like the fact that ZeniMax was trying to like copyright claim just some interesting historic game development footage. So nowadays, anybody with PlayStation Portable emulation, or if they want to like, you know, flash it onto a PSP, can see what the progress was like on The Elder Scrolls Travels Oblivion, and it's kind of interesting. The game wasn't going to just be like a remake of The Elder Scrolls Oblivion. It was going to have its own story, but it would mostly take place around the location of High Rock, and it would have a story involving the Mages Guild. The player still would have woken up in prison and had to escape, and know how the whole Elder Scrolls stuff typically goes. And it seemed like there were a couple of locations and information about what was in the game that were found after the leak happened. Like there was this cool crystal-like cave and a couple of interesting cities too. Now it does seem like a lot of this game was in a way just like a prototype demo for probably what they would continue to build off of. And as we have multiple builds now available to look into at different stages in development, there are interesting things. Like there's a combat demo, for example, where you spawn in a prison and you don't have any like weapons, but you do have spells for flare and heal minor wound spells. So you got that going on. There are some zombies, some skeletons. There are some weapons that you can pick up and try out as well. And yeah, I mean, pretty cool stuff. Then on the other side of things, there's a quest demo where you kind of get to practice, I guess, how quests would work in the game or see how it would work and interact with NPCs that look like this. Also, it's worth noting that in 2 of the developmental builds of the game, there are loading screens that don't have actual loading screens. So instead, there's Ghost Rider placeholders used here for whatever reason. Cool. Why not? But yeah, ultimately, something kind of backfired in ZeniMax and Bethesda's face when they tried to copyright someone uploading prototype footage for a game that had been canceled 10 years earlier, and I guess that triggered someone out there to leak everything, and now anyone can play this game for what it is.
Propeller Arena Aviation Battle Championship was a video game that was supposed to release for Dreamcast consoles in 2001. It was developed and published by Sega and was displayed at E3 of 2001. The game was a multiplayer aerial fighting game where you would face other players through the Dreamcast's online system. The game also was supposed to be set in the future in the year 2045, but instead of flying futuristic airplanes, you were still flying World War II era fighter craft. All the fighters had like a little lore and, you know, there was a lot of different maps. The development of the game was going great. The game would be completely finished before release and was scheduled to hit the release date of September 19th, 2001. Now, obviously a couple days before the scheduled release, the 9/11 attacks happened, and unfortunately, Sega had implemented a map called Tower City, which pretty much resembles New York. Now, obviously, they didn't want to release a airplane game where you fly through a city with airplanes just 8 days after the September 11 attacks. So they made the decision to cancel this game and never release it. I mean, the attacks probably played a huge part in the decision, but also probably the Dreamcast's declining sales also made the decision easier to not release this game, since sales probably wouldn't be that great either. So pairing that with a potential massive controversy if they would go ahead and release this game with a map called Tower City just shortly after these horrible attacks, they would end up canceling the game in September of 2001. Now, only 2 years after this game was cancelled, the first disc image of the game surfaced in 2003 on a peer-to-peer network, making it accessible to fans. And with the game being 100% done, you actually were able to play a pretty decent game. At the time, fans were still hoping for a port to another console since the Dreamcast was dead at this point, but no updates ever came, so these disc images were the only way to really experience this game. In the following years, multiple builds of this game would actually leak, showing off different stages of development. And I mean, once people got their hands on it, they were pretty impressed with this game. It actually was pretty polished and gameplay was pretty fun. There was even attempts to make the online matchmaking work, but apparently it's not possible because it's some Sega-sided server stuff that fans don't really have access to, so nobody was really ever able to play this in matchmaking. But I mean, even the effort shows that people just wanted to play this game. As a multiplayer shooter, it would have been kind of ahead of its time if it ever released. So it's at least good that people are almost able to experience the full game, besides the matchmaking side of things, because apparently they were cooking with this game. Just unfortunate timing. Another online game that was ahead of its time was Phantasy Star Online, which just released a year earlier in Japan and in early 2001 worldwide. This game was developed by the Sonic team at Sega and was trying to reinvent the Phantasy Star series at this point, which had been a single-player RPG series. So this was the first MMO in the franchise. And I mean, I just want to make sure you guys understand how ahead of its time this game was, because not only was this a console MMO, which, you know, was rare at the time, this also had cross-region play, meaning Japanese players could play with Americans or Europeans, which is an insane feat for 2001. And this game did so well that they actually would release a GameCube, Xbox and PC version, which those 4 versions had like different levels of crossplay, which also is insane for 2001. We don't even get crossplay in all the MMOs nowadays. Elder Scrolls Online still doesn't have crossplay. And besides the online features, this game was just good. It was really polished. The way you followed the quests and the way you interacted with other players was really fun. People just really enjoyed this game back in the day. So it was kind of a shock when Sega would announce that the Dreamcast servers for this game would close in 2003 and GameCube, PC and Xbox would close down in 2007 after Phantasy Star Universe, the next MMO in the series, released. With Sega's shift on Phantasy Star Universe taking over all their MMO side of things, fans were kind of left to pick up the pieces on their own if they still wanted to play Phantasy Star Online. So in the mid-2000s, private servers for this game started popping up and becoming more and more popular. And over the years, many of these servers would come and go, and there's still servers nowadays and even modified clients that upgrade the game to make it compatible with modern systems. And the private servers that are still online, they still have stuff going on. They got their own events and tournaments and seasonal activities, and I mean, they're keeping the player base engaged and, you know, just delivering some fresh stuff every now and then. But there's even some more insane ways to play this game because you can still play it on the Dreamcast Online as well. There's ways to connect to private networks and just play online with other players, just like people did in 2000, which is an insane thing to see all these years later, to be honest. Someone playing on original Dreamcast online and there's other players. And I mean, I don't know, I think this is one of the cooler little MMO stories, and I mean, I don't know, I like MMOs, and console MMOs especially are a very interesting topic to me.
Now, when I was a kid, Starfox was something I was like super intrigued with. I don't know, it was one of my first games for the Nintendo 64, and ultimately I just was kind of intrigued by the lore. I'm not a furry, but Starfox Adventures was always an interesting sequel to me. This game was completely different than Star Fox 64. You run around, it's like a Legend of Zelda game kind of, and you hit stuff with a stick, and then there are some small, short space sections that are very minuscule at best. The game in itself, actually not that bad of a game for a not Star Fox game. And the reason I would later find out when I had access to the internet around 9 or 10 years old and I would look up stuff about Star Fox was because this game wasn't a Star Fox game to begin with. It was actually a game known as Dinosaur Planet that was set to release on the Nintendo 64, but then Nintendo was like, hey, this kind of looks like Fox. Make it Star Fox. And this character ended up turning into this character. There was actually a lot of ideas for the original Nintendo 64 that would make their way into the GameCube version later on, but it's so interesting with how much pre-release stuff that actually did come out. It was cool to get a glimpse of what this game looked like on the previous generation, and just in general, what this game would have been like, and the differences and similarities at the same time. I mean, it seemed like Crystal would have played a much bigger role and was a cat. Nonetheless, this game always kind of looked like a fever dream to me, a what could have been in an alternate reality where Rare was back at it again, baking up a fresh new IP to join their incredible lineup on the Nintendo 64. But this game would be repurposed, and that would be that. Star Fox Adventures would release in 2002. It was cool. Maybe not a good Star Fox game, but a cool game in its own right. And yeah, that would be it for Rare. Eventually, there would be a follow-up game in 2004 by Namco called Star Fox Assault, but that kind of was its own beast in its own right. But what about that game for the Nintendo 64, Dinosaur Planet? What ended up happening? Well, that game would be kind of a mystery for years until one day, the Nintendo 64 build of Dinosaur Planet that were used as tech demos and whatnot would end up leaking online. And this is interesting because what this leak wasn't the original demos that people saw like footage of or trailers for. This was an in-between build of Star Fox Adventures after Nintendo had recommended the shift from it being its own IP as Dinosaur Planet into it becoming Star Fox. And a lot of things are kind of in this in-between state, but it looks like a lot of this still is for the original Nintendo 64. And that's interesting. Now, the main character of Dinosaur Planet was a character named Saber, and they decided to shift to this character into Fox. And in this version of the game, you could see they're already transitioning the character. I guess looks like Fox from the Nintendo 64. I mean, better graphics for sure. But at the same time, sometimes the subtitles won't line up and still make a reference to him being Saber. So it was in this like transition state. Ultimately, I think once they decided to shift this to the GameCube, that's when things picked up steam and the aesthetic of the game would turn into what we saw in the GameCube. But it is really, really interesting interesting that we get a glimpse at this in-between state, and a lot of this game is playable. It seems like for the most part, the game is playable mostly beginning to end, though there's a lot of issues with the game itself. It's not polished, there's bugs and whatnot, and some people have even gotten the game running on original Nintendo 64 hardware, which I think is awesome. So kudos to that. There are potentially modding communities out there that are trying to clean up the game, patch out the bugs and whatnot, and finalize this version of the game, which I think is neat too. So yeah, a little piece of history, fortunately enough, came out of nowhere, and people can look at it now.
So the next one, kind of not sure if it fully fits in here because it did actually release. It was just never intended for release in the West. I'm talking about Pokemon Crystal. And no, obviously Pokemon Crystal released in the West, but Pokemon Crystal in Japan had an ambitious integration of online connectivity via the mobile system GB, a service that was only available in Japan and utilized the mobile Gameboy adapter to connect Gameboy systems to cell phone services for internet-like features. Players were able to connect and trade Pokemon or battle with other players across Japan, very similar to the modern Wi-Fi trading and battling we have. There was integration with Pokemon Stadium 2 for viewing and simulating battles in 3D, to where I think you could send your Pokemon data to Pokemon Stadium and then see your Pokemon in like the 3D format. There was even ranked matchmaking in the Battle Tower and a friend list feature. But the feature that was actually really ahead of its time was that there was news updates and DLC that you could download right into your game. This could vary from things like mini games to item drops like a GS ball you could get so you can go catch that Celebi. This was a pioneer step toward online gaming, and Nintendo believed that the Pokemon franchise was ideal for demonstrating mobile technology because of the game's emphasis on trading and collecting. And I mean, they were kinda right back in the day, and they're still kinda right nowadays with the statement, because you guys saw the insane numbers that their new Pokemon trading card game did. It made like tens of millions of dollars in the first couple days. Nonetheless, this mobile integration had a lot of features that wouldn't become commonplace in Pokemon until years later. Like, we wouldn't get the global connectivity for trading and stuff until Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. Also, the fact that this was the earliest form of DLC in the Pokemon series is pretty insane to me too. Now, while this was a cool feature, this actually wasn't too popular in Japan, and it would end up getting discontinued in December of 2002, just 2 years after the game had released. And I mean, it would have been really hard for them to implement it in the West in any countries, because I mean, I know nowadays from experience going to different countries, like, it's still like sometimes a hassle to get a SIM card working. So adapting this Japanese mobile technology to other countries probably was extremely hard in the early 2000s. So I can see why they opted for not bringing it to the West ever. And I mean, obviously, also it was a commercial failure in Japan. Nonetheless, this laid the groundwork for many modern online features in Nintendo's later consoles and future Pokemon games. I mean, this just kind of seemed like an early testing ground for what would become with Nintendo consoles and online capabilities in the future. I mean, the next console after the Game Boy generation was the Nintendo DS, which had online capabilities and Wi-Fi connection. I just think this was such an insane feature they brought back in the day, and I mean, I don't know, I think it's pretty cool. Obviously, looking back at those like adapters you had to plug into everything and stuff is kind of goofy, and while we never got to see this original mobile system GB in the West, we did eventually get some of the features that they, I guess, tested with this project. Before Halo 2 release, Bungie had this running gag that their next game was gonna be Pimps at Sea, and for over a decade this joke was pretty persistent at Bungie, and you know, was humorously referred to many times over the years. And during Halo 3's development, when people would look at the gamer tags of developers, if they were playing a Halo 3 build, it would actually say they're playing Pimps at Sea. So why am I talking about this? Well, last year the Pimps at Sea build of Halo 3 actually leaked, and there's tons of leaked Halo builds from over the years from different Halo games, reaching from Halo C through like modern Halo even. But to me, this one is the most interesting ones, because first of all, I mean, obviously it was that running gag at Bungie, and I mean, everybody know about this Pimps at Sea build, but also this is a very early alpha version of Halo 3, which means it is Halo 3, but there's a lot of Halo 2 assets still in this. For example, you can load in the Halo 2 Elites, but besides those assets, there was also a prototype multiplayer system and an early version of Forge titled titled Editor. A lot of weapons were different or untextured, and there was just like some interesting designs for equipment or vehicles that you can see in this build that didn't actually end up making it into Halo 3. There was even experimental features like being able to lean left or right and peek around corners. And while this stuff was pretty unfinished, and I mean they would end up cutting a lot of this, it is just very interesting to see what could have been. Also, there's early versions of maps like Valhalla, Snowbound, or High Ground. And while they are early versions, they look pretty close to what we would actually end up getting. So it is interesting that this early in development, they already had these maps figured out. But there's a couple other Halo things I would like to mention. First of all, there's that build that they revealed at Macworld 1999. Before Microsoft had purchased Bungie or anything, the game was a third-person shooter and it was quite different. There was different environments, different enemies, different animals, different weapons, different vehicles, and Master Chief was also looking different. So while there was ways to access this build, they would actually officially release this on the Steam Workshop with help from the Dixie team that would go into the code and restore all the things that Bungie didn't end up putting into Halo CE. So a lot of the stuff was obviously never in players' hands before, and it's kind of cool that you're able to play it now. Plus, also, they would end up releasing the infamous Halo 2 E3 demo from back in the day, which is a completely different version of Halo 2 that would end up getting scrapped and never saw the light of day. Besides the E3 before Halo 2's release, the only other insight we had into the Halo 2 E3 demo was a community livestream that 343 did like 10 years ago or something, where they found an old development Xbox and they would play through the demo and kind of show us the levels and stuff that were done. But once again, the Dixie team ended up restoring it, and you can download it on the Steam Workshop now and actually play it, and it's pretty interesting and cool to explore. So shout out to those two projects they did, because it's pretty cool that it's playable now. Paragon was a third-person multiplayer online battle arena game. In short, it was a MOBA developed by Epic Games. The game entered early access in March of 2016 as a free-to-play title on PlayStation and PC, and less than 2 years later, the game would be shut down, because apparently, nobody was playing this game and the development wasn't going as well as they thought it would. So the game's servers officially were closed in April of 2018. Following the shutdown, Epic Games released Paragon's asset, valued at over 17 million for free to all Unreal Engine 4 developers. This included 39 characters and over 1,500 environment components, which actually is a very nice thing that they did. Now, with these assets available for free, there were some developers and some fans that tried to actually revive Paragon or make a Paragon-like game. There was even an official one where Netmarble acquired all the rights to the Paragon assets, including the name and everything, and they would release Paragon the Overprime, which entered early access in December of 2022. And there was some people who were initially interested in this, but this game would also shut down in 2024. Now, at the same time that the Overprime was kind of being developed and being in early access, there was another promising project that used the assets from Paragon called Predecessor. Development on Predecessor kind of started in 2021 when they would secure funding for this game, and a little over a year later it would enter paid early access on Epic Games and Steam, with a free-to-play open beta launching earlier this year. Now, Predecessor continues to receive regular updates and maintains an active player base. It kind of nowadays is the most prominent way to still play Paragon, a game that's been shut down for over 6 years, but the spirit lives on in this game, which is kind of an interesting story. Though I do have to say, Predecessor, it's not the most popular game. I mean, it's doing fine, but besides Paragon the Overprime, which is the one that shut down, there was a lot of other projects that also shut down over the years, so we'll have to wait and see if Predecessor one day will also disappear. And then it'll be a case of not being able to play Paragon once again. We talked about Resident Evil for the Game Boy earlier, but there's another Resident Evil project that was cancelled and was never supposed to see the light of day, and that game is referred to as Resident Evil 1.5. Resident Evil 1.5 was a prototype for Resident Evil 2, developed by Capcom in the mid-1990s for the PlayStation 1. It would feature Leon S. Kennedy and a new character called Elsa Walker, who was a motorcycle racer and would have been the main female protagonist of Resident Evil 1.5. Besides having a different main character, this version of the game also had a modern version of the Raccoon City Police Department, and the storyline wasn't connected to the first game. Even Leon's story would have been a little bit different. He would have still been a rookie police officer, but he would have already been at the police department and not just arrived there. Also, some of the side characters were playing a bigger role than they would in Resident Evil 2, like Linda, who would be reworked into Ada, was gonna be more involved in the story overall. It also had some experimental features like armor upgrades that are visible on the character and clothing damage to show you how, torn up your character is, instead of like the limping mechanic we would actually actually get in Resident Evil 2. Also, some of the animations were actually more dynamic, like the zombie models would actually change when you hit them, and they had like different stages of damage, which is something I don't think was implemented into the original Resident Evil 2, but would be implemented in the remake of Resident Evil 2. Now, with all that, why was it cancelled? Well, the developers and directors and producers felt that the game was kind of uninspired and kind of lacked a lot of things that made the first game interesting. They looked at the game and they were like, this is too dull, the environments are too simple, and it's just not that atmospheric overall, especially comparing it to the setting from the first game. This game would have been quite a big shift in atmosphere, and with almost no story ties, they were like, what's the point of this? We're trying to make this a franchise after all. So then they made the decision to completely restart development and scrap this build. And for a long time, it was just a rumor that Resident Evil 1.5 exists somewhere out there. But in 2011, fans purchased a partially complete version for $8,000 from a collector. And starting in 2013, multiple different builds of this game would start leaking over the next couple years. Nowadays, there is fan projects that restore and patch the game to run on modern hardware, and you're actually able to get like a good 2 to 3 hours of gameplay out of this. So I think that's pretty sick actually. And you know, when I was looking at the footage for this game, I do have to say, I mean, this had a completely different vibe than Resident Evil 2 would end up having. So it's very interesting to get to play this and just kind of experience this piece of history.
Let's talk a little bit about Club Penguin, because this game definitely is going to date me a little bit, but there was a brief period of time where I was into the Club Penguin scene when I was a kid, and I was amongst the other penguins. Actually, I recently remembered my earliest memories of what I thought was Club Penguin, but as it turned out wasn't Club Penguin, it was Penguin Chat, which was like right before Club Penguin launched. It was the precursor to Club Penguin. You just walk around in the snow and talk to people, penguins, I don't know. But then Club Penguin would be like the big evolution. As a kid, I always thought they were the same thing, just, you know, built off of each other with more content. But no, Club Penguin was its own interesting thing. But when Club Penguin would finally be shut down in 2017 because Disney wanted to launch a mobile app called like Club Penguin Island that would then fail miserably, fans of the original Club Penguin wanted to see things continue to exist. And while Disney was ending Club Penguin, not wanting, you know, support of the game to continue, there were fans out there who were like, hey, let's keep this thing going. And thus the era of Club Penguin clone MMO websites would begin. And there are quite a few of them, but some of them are gone now as well. There is so much lore and drama behind what was going on in some of these fan Club Penguin communities, some very deplorable stuff, but not every community was led by a bunch of degenerates, just a few of them. One of the most notorious Club Penguin fan communities was called Club Penguin Online. And mind you, a lot of the times, all of the little fan projects get grouped together as like being the same single project that had all the controversy around it. But no, there are multiple different communities, all with their own controversies and issues, or not in some cases. Club Penguin Online would be the most detestable of the Club Penguin fan communities, and this one would go on to set a precedent where Disney would be very aggressive with enforcing their copyright on this game moving forward. Back in 2020, a report was published that suggested that Club Penguin Online was full of hate speech, sexual content, and worse. These reports caused BBC to launch an investigation, and they found homophobic, anti-Semitic, and sexual comments all over the place, and apparently this version of the game didn't have any like official moderation stopping the inappropriate conduct and just kind of allowing slurs and personal information to be freely shared, you know, in a game that was obviously made to target children. The BBC would also report that there were instances of players being involved in penguin e-sex. The BBC even spoke with a 14-year-old who said that they've seen people advertising strip club igloos and people asking for pimps, and said that there's a lot of swearing and other crazy things. Yeah, didn't take long for Disney to be like, yeah, we're shutting this thing down. We're not letting these fan servers exist for any longer. But there's more lore here. You see, when Club Penguin originally shut down, people were looking for alternatives, and a new one, Club Penguin Rewritten, ended up releasing right around the time that the original Club Penguin was getting a lot of attention because it was shutting down. And Club Penguin Rewritten was a gold essential to keep Club Penguin alive. Also at the time, the development team working on Rewritten claimed that Rewritten would fall under fair use protections in the US, and this fan project strived to stay as authentic as possible to the original Club Penguin experience. However, when COVID-19 pandemic started, the game would end up getting a huge influx of new users. A lot of teenagers and other people would jump on this version of Club Penguin to, get a sense of escapism or something. This led to a lot of virtual events being recreated in Club Penguin, like prom or graduation ceremonies. And it was interesting. While one Club Penguin server was shut down, another one was thriving and growing in more bigger popularity than ever before. As of late 2020, it was estimated to have over 8 million registered users. However, Disney shutting down anything that could be potentially harmful, and the fact that Club Penguin Rewritten still was using their IP to collect information from users, even if it was just like a username and password. There was no official moderation, so Disney was essentially going after anything using their IP here, and they would put in an official request for the games to shut down. The game would be investigated for copyright issues, and the developers had to grant police control over the website, which ended up also shutting it down. There was a lot of things going on here. While this investigation was going on, 3 suspects actually were arrested on suspicion of distributing materials infringing copyright, and they got released 2 days later, as long as they provided assistance in the copyright investigation. And by the time the game was officially shut down, it seemed like 11 million users had registered to play this version of the game. It seemed like ultimately the fact that COVID brought a lot of attention to Club Penguin Rewritten and the shutdown Club Penguin Online, the amount of PR happening with Club Penguin that wasn't because of Disney, resulted in unwanted attention, I guess, from Disney going after Club Penguin Rewritten, and that would end up shutting down as well. Now, technically, if you really wanted to go and experience Club Penguin again today, just for nostalgia purposes, there are a few other community-ran servers of Club Penguin that are all different in some ways or another, and I don't have too much information about what their communities are like, so take that as a light cautionary recommendation if you really want to go back and play these games. But there are other servers out there that we were able to find, like Club Penguin Journey, New Club Penguin, and Club Penguin Legacy, which seems to be the biggest of the remaining Club Penguin websites. Now remember, the original reason Club Penguin shut down was because Disney wanted to launch a bigger thing that could work on iOS and Android, and this time use an actual gaming engine instead of Adobe Flash Player. So Club Penguin Island would end up being Disney's successor, and it was canceled after 1 year. Yeah, that's it. It wasn't very good. It was lacking. It was weird. It just wasn't as good as the original version. I don't know. I just don't think people liked it. And the whole model felt very, gimmicky. Not really the charm that the original Club Penguin had. Nonetheless, they did add an offline mode in 2018. And yeah, that was a thing. You could play by yourself. I don't think anyone still plays this version of the game. Now, while Disney, had Club Penguin, they also had another MMO that was pretty popular in the mid-2000s, ToonTown Online, which this game would actually shut down in 2013 after operating for 10 years. Now, during the end of ToonTown's life, players would receive free memberships with the game's remaining time. There was special in-game events and whatnot, but ultimately, ToonTown had run its course, I guess. I mean, if you were a kid playing ToonTown in 2003 and you're 10 years older at this point. But ToonTown would end up having a much better life than Club Penguin after its inevitable shutdown. After the shutdown of ToonTown Online, fans would go on to create a free-to-play private server that would be known as ToonTown Rewritten, which ended up becoming pretty popular, especially with it launching in September of 2014, just about a year after the initial ToonTown shutdown. This, unlike Club Penguin, would end up being around for quite a while. I mean, it's still technically around to this day, and they haven't had to deal with any Disney coming in and copywriting stuff or whatnot. Matter of fact, in 2021, an unofficial archive of ToonTown Online called the ToonTown Preservation Project would end up being released by ToonTown Rewritten. And this was an archive of original design documents and artwork that had been donated by the game developers directly. Whether it was random things like promotional material, digital download, merchandise, newsletters, trading cards, websites, everything is intended to be documented. And I think that that's really cool, especially if some of the stuff was donated directly from game developers, because it's weird when you work on a game for, a decade or something like that, and then it gets shut down, and the only people who are even keeping the game alive are the fans at that point. And as a developer yourself, you have no control over something like this. So if you want to see, people continue to appreciate the stuff that you spent years on, it's kind of neat that there's this other side of the community here keeping things going. I don't know.
Infinity is a turn-based RPG originally developed for the Game Boy Color by Affinix Software, a small indie studio in the early 2000s. The game was highly ambitious, featuring advanced graphics, a deep story, and gameplay systems that pushed the Game Boy Color hardware to its limits. And despite being near completion, Infinity was cancelled in 2001 due to market conditions and financial constraints. By 2001, the market kind of changed and people weren't as interested in Game Boy Color games anymore because the Game Boy Advance had released. So for a small studio like this, it was incredibly hard to secure a publisher for a Game Boy Color game because publishers just wouldn't touch Game Boy Color games anymore. And since they were a small studio, they lacked the funding to self-publish. So even though the game looked amazing, it was kind of just bad timing that led to the cancellation of this, and they had to move on to other projects. But in 2016, Affinix Software released the unfinished ROM of Infinity to the public for free. They shared it because they wanted to preserve the team's work and allow fans to experience the game, even though it was incomplete. The ROM was pretty good, people enjoyed it, and it had the game's core system implemented, but it didn't have a proper ending and it was kind of unpolished. But in 2021, this game was revived by Incube 8 Games and retro RPG developer Retro Modding. They collaborated with some of the original members of Affinix Software that worked on Infinity, and they would launch a Kickstarter campaign that would aim to finish and release the game in physical cartridge for the Game Boy Color, as well as digital formats, obviously. And the campaign would pass its funding goals quickly, and people were really interested in this retro RPG seeing a finished release. So with the funding from Kickstarter, they actually finalized the game, they fixed bugs, they polished the graphics, and they added a proper ending. And from what I can tell, they did a really good job at, staying true to the original vision for this game. And in 2022, they actually would send out the cartridges more than 20 years after the initial development was cancelled. And I do think it's kind of nice that this game did end up getting finished because, I don't know, it was ambitious and it really seemed like the developers were convinced that this game was really good, and it was really good. So even though it did take 20 years, it must feel pretty good if you're a developer of this game to finally see your game released 20 years later.
Ever since I was just a youthling watching YouTube videos back in middle school, the early content of Halo was definitely a very different place back around 2007. And while this was a time where there was always Halo speculation and fans talking about what would come in the future, whether it was images that were clearly from a Halo 4 game that never actually were real, to rumors of Halo coming to the Xbox 720, there was one other discussion that was common in the Halo community, and it was whether or not Halo would make its way to the Nintendo DS. Now, these are things that were talked about amongst Halo fans a ton back in the day, whether or not Halo would make the jump to a portable console. And then one day, out of the blue, a video surfaced online from IGN showcasing a pitch for Halo DS with a little bit of multiplayer footage shown on the Halo 2 and Halo 3 multiplayer level Zanzibar, and honestly, people were shook with that video. I mean, not only did this actually look new and different, but it seemingly was a playable demo of a Halo game, and the person in the video actually suggested that this was developed by a AAA developer and not some garage studio, and the buzz around this video actually really started to blow up. Now, if my memory serves me right, around the time that this was released online, it did appear that this prototype was already discarded and it was a canceled project, or not something that was in any active production. The guy in the video was Matt Casamassina from IGN, and just months later, we actually got an official acknowledgement from Bungie themselves about this Halo DS game, which definitely kind of put a cap on a lot of the rumors, where both Frank O'Connor and Brian Gerard stated that it's very likely that somebody at some point in time created a prototype and tried to pitch it, which is probably what Casamassina was talking about. So boom, just like that, rumor dead. The Halo DS wasn't ever something fully in development. They even went on to explicitly say that there has never been any officially funded or sanctioned development of any sort of Halo DS game. Okay, cool. So then what are they playing in that video? Well, a lot of people really jumped into looking into the video itself, analyzing everything that was there. In the actual gameplay, it did show some interesting things, like the SMG and plasma rifle being dual wielded. It seemed like the bottom of the screen would be used for a motion tracker, and if you're just trying to figure out how controls would have worked, because it's a Nintendo DS, there's no analog sticks back on those old ones. If it was anything like the other first-person shooter games that released on the DS, you likely would use the D-pad and the left trigger to walk around and possibly jump, and then you would use the stylus to move around and maybe either tap on a certain part of the screen or just tap on the screen to shoot the weapon, as that's how games like Metroid and Call of Duty usually worked. Some eagle-eyed Nintendo DS aficionados were able to recognize that some of the elements in the HUD and some of the sound effects that were used for the weapons looked and sounded eerily like another video game that already was released on the Nintendo DS, GoldenEye Rogue Agent, which was also a first-person shooter set in the James Bond universe. Now mind you, this DS game wasn't a remake of the classic GoldenEye that everyone knows from the Nintendo 64 game. It was a separate game about some different agent, not James Bond, who had a golden eye. Honestly, I was very disappointed by this game as a kid. So it then begs the question if that original DS version of GoldenEye were the grounds for what ended up being a pitch to Microsoft and Bungie for a potential Halo DS game. Now, it does seem very interesting to see some sort of working multiplayer here, where we can see two players connected wirelessly over a DS on whatever this demo cartridge must have been. And obviously, it does have those classic DS graphics, but mind you, back in the mid to late 2000s, DS first-person shooter games were kind of an accepted thing. I mean, Nintendo released Metroid, which actually worked really well, and there was all those Call of Duty games that were releasing on the DS. They had to have been making money because they kept releasing more and more of them, but nonetheless, that is where Halo ended up when it came to this massive speculative mystery that triumphantly ended nowhere. But still, it is really interesting to think back that at some point or another, there was this demo that was made, and at least someone had the idea as to what if Halo was released on the DS. And it is interesting to think back what Halo's community nowadays would have looked like had it did see a release on the DS, and even more interestingly, if the DS version was really good. I mean, back in the day, the DS games were hit or miss when it came to FPSs. It would be really interesting to see a bunch of fans of Halo who didn't have an Xbox or a PC back in the day, and they were introduced to Halo through their Nintendo DS of all things. Interestingly enough, just based off of the footage that we had from Zanzibar, I feel like they could have done a very interesting adaptation of an existing Halo story, like Combat Evolved, where maybe it wasn't an exact one-to-one replica, but the same story was being told, and it might have actually been kind of okay. And then when players eventually got up and got an Xbox and got to experience the game in all of its original glory, it probably would have been a really hype moment. But it did, in a way, kind of end the speculation as to whether or not a Halo game would ever be available in a portable form, but then also made some fans take matters into their own hands. After that Halo DS video was out, there were a ton of people who didn't want to give up on the hope that maybe there would be a Halo portable game one day. Some people loved the idea. They decided to troll online, and they would use a DS flash cart and load up a low resolution video of some Halo footage or whatever, and then they would play it back on the Nintendo DS, and then they'd make sure to have some shaky camera or something like that and press the buttons and pretend that they were playing the Halo game, even though there was no way that that would be possible. There also were some big fan projects for the PlayStation Portable in an attempt to recreate the Halo experience in a unique way for the PSP. There's a couple projects that were really popular using the Quake engine, like JLo, and one of them that's still playable to this day that is kind of somewhat popular is actually a game called Halo Revamp. And our buddy Arash actually did a video breaking all that down a while back, and you should check it out because this is news to us, and we were just looking up stuff about Halo DS, and this popped up, and we're like, that's really interesting. And mind you, it's not official by any means, but it is really cool to see a first-person shooter game that has an iconic set piece, iconic weapons, and levels like Halo kind of put in a different form or having to work within different limitations. It's something that we think is really cool to see. This is actually later ported to the 3DS, so with some mod tools, players have been able to actually finally have Halo on a DS on the go, though it's not anything official, but hey, that's something interesting. Interestingly enough, there was a South Park game that was in development for the Game Boy Color that was pretty much finished, which is crazy to think about. While the game was pretty much fully finished and days away from being prepared for shipment, the creators of
of South Park, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, actually discussed that the Game Boy Color was marketed more towards kids and the show was an adult television series. Back during the original peak popularity of South Park, I don't think a whole lot of adults or late teens had Game Boy Colors, at least not a wide enough market. This technically was the first ever South Park game to be completed, but ultimately it would go unused and would be canceled. However, the game itself would survive in one way or another, as a reskin of the game would eventually release, as the game would be reprogrammed as Maya the Bee for European releases, and The New Adventures of Mary Kate and Ashley in the United States. That game would be reskinned even more to Mary Kate and Ashley Get a Clue, but the European version, Maya the Bee, actually still has some South Park assets found in the game files, according to the Lost Media Wiki. Thanks to the Lost Media community, a user known as Da Cool Dude actually got in contact with one of the head developers of the game and was able to get a copy of the ROM, which would then be dumped online, and to this day you can play the original South Park version, despite the fact that the game got pulled last minute before its release.
You guys know that Diablo was supposedly maybe coming to the Game Boy at one point? Yeah, back in the day, and by back in the day I mean 2002, 2003, there was development for about 4 months on what potentially could become a Diablo game for Game Boy. Now, they were just working on the OG Game Boy, and then later they would decide if they wanted to scale things up for Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance. And ultimately, this was just a prototype to see how a Diablo game could potentially play on a handheld system. And it seemed like at Blizzard North, there was a team of about 4 people working on the project, and they just kind of started developing stuff to see what it would be like, test the waters out, and ultimately, after about 4 months or so, the game would be scrapped when the other half of Blizzard South, caught wind that the game was being prototyped, which I guess they didn't even know about. There wasn't the high likelihood of this game becoming super profitable like, other games that were released on Battle.net. We didn't expect the ROM of this demo to end up leaking online, and to be honest, it probably wasn't that big of a deal that it did end up leaking online. Like, I don't think Blizzard was like, oh no, how could this happen? Everything's done. It's over. We're done for now. I'm pretty sure not a lot of people even noticed that you could play it. There's really not a lot to play. You can see the Diablo on the main menu, and you can walk around a bit. And that's literally it. That is the basis of it. I mean, from a technical standpoint, it's interesting how they did the whole isometric view, and they got walking and these animations in there, and even the main menu. Interesting. It only had 4 months of development, and they were just trying to test out what it's like programming for a Game Boy. But from a gameplay perspective, there's not a lot going on. So I don't think it was ever intended for people to even see this build. I think if this game was even greenlit, which would have been a very slim chance of that ever happening, it wouldn't have been this build anyways. They would have built something bigger and better. But nonetheless, this is what we got to look at, and it's basic, but cool. After the success of Saints Row 1 and Saints Row 2, Volition aimed to make a port of the then popular Saints Row 2 game, but for the PlayStation Portable. You see, while Saints Row 1 originally was an Xbox 360 exclusive game, Saints Row 2 made the jump over to the PlayStation 3 and Windows thanks to the help of Mass Media Games. And early on in development for the PlayStation Portable title, Mass Media Games was tasked with this project. However, during the earliest development and conceptual stages of this game, plans quickly shifted, and this game would be spiraled into a game of its own with its own unique story. So with that plan in mind, Volition shifted the development over to a different studio known as Savage Entertainment, and they had more experience developing PlayStation Portable titles, so it made sense. So with the plan of it being a Saints Row port turning into a new individual and unique game, at one point in development, this game was titled Saints Row The Fall, and plans for the story would have originally taken place sometime between the events of the first Saints Row game and Saints Row 2. This would mostly make sense because at the end of Saints Row 1, the game ends on a cliffhanger, and Saints Row 2 starts off after many years. Players learn that the Saints are no more. This PSP title, called Saints Row The Fall, likely would have followed the story of the collapse of the Saints, though that's mostly just speculation here, as there's not too much known about what the original story was. During these early development stages, it seemed like Saints Row 2 ended up becoming way more popular than anyone expected, and Volition changed direction again, this time wanting the Saints Row game to shift to be a sequel to the existing Saints Row 2 game. According to the website Unseen64, Saints Row PSP would have had players take on the role of an undercover cop who joins the 3rd Street Saints just in a time where the Saints split into a civil war. But towards the end of the game, the player character, who's this undercover cop, would end up betraying the police and joining up with the Saints permanently. One thing that's really interesting though is this game would be changed in titles again, this time to Saints Row Undercover. Now, Saints Row Undercover was originally planned as a game to be similar to the Grand Theft Auto series on the PSP. It aimed to retain the core gameplay elements of the Saints Row series, including that over-the-top action, the open world, character customization, and cooperative multiplayer. The game was set to have 20 main story missions along with the familiar side activities that Saints Row was known for at the time, and this game actually was in development long enough to have a playable prototype developed for the game. But after several reviews, Volition felt that the game did not meet their standards for what a Saints Row game should be, and the project ultimately would end up getting cancelled. But what's really interesting is years later, a Volition employee named Josh Stinson, who worked as an associate video editor, stumbled upon a PSP dev kit while exploring the office, and he shared the discovery with some other people at the office, and the team at Volition decided that they should show off what this game would have been like, as at the very least this canceled game was worth having some form of preservation, and fans were really excited just to see what the game would have been like. In January of 2016, Volition live streamed on Twitch Saints Row Undercover, showing for the first time what the game would have had to offer. And there was a rare internal design document that was also released, revealing the full plans and extent for what this game would have been. They even released the ISO file so fans would be able to go and play the playable prototype themselves, which is something completely unheard of. We looked through all these files pretty extensively for this video, and there is some really interesting things here. As for the world, this game would have had Saints Row 1 and 2 City Stillwater reused once again, with assets from Saints Row 2 used as the bulk of the game's template, but they would create a lower poly, smaller texture world to best work with the platform. There would be some small revisions though made from the Saints Row 2 version of the map, reverting certain sections back to how Saints Row 1 handled the map, just to trim down the overall scale. And some interior locations, such as gun stores like Friendly Fire, would be reduced from an actual location you could walk around to just a UI menu where you could buy stuff. Characters like Johnny Gat, Shondi, and Pierce would return. Even Deputy Chief Troy would be back as well, along with some new characters as well. In the opening missions of the game, a new gang would have rolled up on the 3rd Street Saints, led by someone named Lady Ranja, and with a ton of fighting in the streets, Commissioner Troy Bradstreet decides he needs a mole in the Saints to try to reunify the gang, and since no current officer in Stillwater wants to be involved, they look at a police academy of new trainees for a potential person, and that's where the player, who is this undercover officer, gets picked from. There'd be 2 levels where you were in the academy still, which would have served as like training levels teaching you how to play the game, and then the player would join the Saints by essentially following some leads and then having to win a 5-man fight to the death in a park, and from there they meet Johnny Gat. Wow. From there the story would still retain a lot of the original Civil War plans that they had for Saints Row The Fall that would have been between Saints Row 1 and 2, except some of them just play out during this game instead. Some Saints would end up turning on the rest of the 3rd Street Saints, joining up with Lady Ranja. And then of course at the end, the player's faced with a decision to stay a cop or become a saint, and he chooses to become a saint. From this design document, it appears that the whole script was fully written and approved, though it doesn't quite look like the prototype build of the game had gotten the full story elements implemented yet. Then the design document has a bunch of talk about co-op and how AI mapping will work for vehicles and pedestrians and whatnot. It looks like there was also a ton of thought put into what character customization would look like and vehicle customization. I mean, these obviously are concept images, but it's kind of impressive how much they were planning on going here. But honestly, reading through this design document that's 122 pages is a pretty interesting read. It seems like a lot of Saints Row ideas were fully fleshed out, and this game intended on being as closely on par to what Saints Row 2 was, for example, like, with only cutting out things that absolutely had to be cut down. Even the parts like sound design, where there was some concern about how they were going to have diversity in the way that sound came across in the game, it seemed like it was written out in a way that was thoroughly thought
through in an attempt to minimize a loss in quality from a handheld version of a game. I think it's a real shame that this game never actually ended up seeing a release. Now, it does seem like the concept for this game, though, stayed alive a little bit longer than a lot of people may have noticed. While there isn't a lot of details as to what happened next in regards to Saints Row, the fact that to an extent this game was playable sometime in 2009 has led many fans to believe that there were intentions for this game to eventually be reworked and re-released, though on the Nintendo 3DS. E3 2010, Saints Row Drive-By was announced, and this would have been a 3DS title that now would have been the first handheld title in the franchise. Many fans speculate that with the PlayStation Portable getting older and the 3DS technically being the new jump for technology, at some point in development, perhaps Volition thought that this Saints Row game would work better on the 3DS and a new title would be announced, though nothing really ended up coming from that. Now, we don't know too much about the 2010 3DS Saints Row Drive-By game announcement. All that they said was that the game would still take place in Stillwater, despite the fact that Saints Row III, which was coming up for the following year, would already shift away from Stillwater and be taking place in Steelport. This led even more fans to speculate that that PlayStation Portable game Undercover was just that game being shifted to the 3DS for Drive-By.
Does anyone remember the Gizmondo handheld console from 2005? Well, I didn't either, and it's a pretty obscure console that sold under 25,000 units. Made by some obscure European company that merged with some flooring company in Florida. Yeah, I don't know what's going on here. Nonetheless, this company was notorious for just wasting money and not making any profits. They were trying to sell this handheld for $400 in the mid-2000s. Also, this whole system only had 14 games with 30 titles that were in development but were cancelled due to the company going bankrupt like a year after releasing this handheld. One of those cancelled games is called Colors though, which is a more interesting title. This was an ambitious urban combat game designed as a gritty Grand Theft Auto inspired experience. It was set in a massive city, the game focused on gang activities, turf wars, and criminal exploits, much like the Grand Theft Auto series. The visuals apparently weren't that bad either, being described as something between PlayStation 1 and PSP. You were able to explore the city as a gang member, engage in shootouts, and even start your own gang. All this was actually coupled with the Gizmondo's innovative GPS functionality. Yes, this had a GPS system in it, and they were trying to market the games in a way where the GPS integration would be helpful to whatever game you're experiencing, which I don't know, that doesn't really make sense, and I mean, probably why this handheld failed. But apparently you were supposed to be able to claim like real world territory for like your in-game gang. I don't know, I don't know how it worked. Honestly, it was really hard figuring out how this whole GPS thing was integrated into any of these games. And I mean, Colors was never finished and the GPS integration wasn't finished either. But we have leaks of this game and there's ROMs out there. You are able to play this game through emulation, or there's people playing it on original handhelds as well. So it's a pretty crazy little footnote that most people never even knew about.
So Luke, Sandy got me something interesting. You want to see it?
Sure.
Okay, check this out. Ready?
Yeah.
I'm going to put my microphone down. Hold on.
Oh my god.
What?
Is that a toy car?
Yeah, but look, check this out. Check this out. Ready?
Isn't that cool? Oh, dude! I knocked down the pictures. Oh my god.
Luke, don't you wish we live in a world where Halo Mega Bloks actually would have released?
Yeah, I mean, it looks better than some mainline Halo games we've gotten.
You're not wrong. So Halo Mega Bloks was interesting. This game was revealed a couple of years back as a canceled project that 343 had greenlit for a prototype and then opted into not moving forward with. However, leaks of this build would eventually surface online with video footage, and eventually builds would actually surface as well where people can go and play the builds themselves. It seemed like for the most part there was only one level actually completed, but ultimately that was about it. I mean, but it looked cool. I mean, there was like Halo-inspired stuff going on for sure, but it's Mega Bloks.
Oh, we did a video on it a while ago, and if I remember correctly, it was pretty much like the Lego games, but like, you know, a little less polished maybe. But it looked cool, I don't know. It had like puzzles and stuff. It probably would have been fun for like a spin-off game.
So one interesting thing is there is like a small community of people who have been trying to mod that build of the game to make more prototype stuff from that build accessible. I think they were able to find
codes to extend the first level. So there's like more stuff that's been out there that's been worked on, though progress has been slow. Yeah, someone from our Discord server named Spark the Dragon had reached out to me saying that he was a part of like a team who was trying to like get stuff going with the Halo Mega Blocks and get it back. And they're still working on like repairing a lot of the bugs and stuff. But it's cool that there are community of people out there trying to just like make some stuff happen there.
Now let's talk about the Stalker franchise. And by the Stalker franchise, I mean the original vision for this franchise, which was completely different than the post-apocalyptic Chernobyl setting we have nowadays. Back in 2001, the publisher and developer of Stalker revealed a game called Stalker Oblivion Lost. And it was just called Stalker without the dots. You know how there's the dots now? Like S.T.A.
Oh, it was like an acronym.
Right. Well, it doesn't stand for anything, I think. They just like didn't want to get copyrighted. Or they, I don't know, wanted to avoid issues with the name Stalker and the copyright, whatever. But the original vision for the game was completely different than whatever we have nowadays. It was supposed to be a futuristic setting, like futuristic guns, robot NPCs, and then you would be taken back in these like Aztec map or ancient Egypt maps. So it kind of played on that thing that kind of Perfect Dark plays on, with like the aliens and ancient Egypt. Doesn't that do a little bit?
I don't know about the Egypt connection too much. I guess there is the Aztec stuff in Perfect Dark Zero.
Yeah, maybe that's what I'm remembering. I just remember that was something like that. But it was supposed to be that vibe, which is quite a bit different than obviously Chernobyl, which they eventually changed to during development. But this original version is leaked online and you can actually play it. And there's fan-made projects and remakes that are trying to expand it or, you know, trying to build on the original ideas. And obviously there's the base builds that you can play in there. Kind of playable. There isn't too much content in them. As far as I know, there's only like one map, which has like an Aztec pyramid and some undergrounds, and there's like tanks and robots on it. It's pretty weird, but it definitely is one of the most jarring comparison if you put it right next to the first Stalker game, Shadow of Chernobyl. I don't know, just like how much it changed from this to that.
Do you feel like Stalker games would be better if they were co-op?
Probably, yeah. I mean, the new Stalker could have been fun if it was co-op, yeah.
I just feel like we would have been more quick to jump on it, even with bugs and stuff if it was co-op.
Yeah, I mean, I don't care as much about the bugs, but yeah, I don't know. Single player game's hard.
Yeah. Oh well, I mean, still cool though that we can see these builds all this time later. So we want to go back to ancient video game history, right? We should look at the 1994 game known as Zero Tolerance, which was, or is claimed to be, I don't know if it, like it could be, it's up for debate, but it definitely counts as one of the very first, if not the very first person shooter on console, as the game Zero Tolerance first released on the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. And that's kind of cool. I mean, there were some other games that would come out like Bloodshot and Duke Nukem 3D and some other game called Corporation, apparently.
Did we just talk about Duke Nukem 3D as well?
We did, yeah. But Zero Tolerance, whatever, they've made the claim, or there was the claim at some point that it was the first ever console first-person shooter. It's pretty straightforward. It was like a futuristic game. You fight stuff. But, interestingly enough, there was multiplayer for the consoles, but it was like LAN before LAN was a thing. So you could connect two Sega Genesises together using a special link cable that would go into the second joypad port, and you could like play with two consoles in the same room, multiplayer, which is really, really innovative for Sega Genesis times.
This kind of sounds like the thing they had for the Game Boy.
Kind of like the link cable, yeah. But for a first-person shooter, it's incredible. Now, at the same time, they were apparently supposed to pack the cable with the game, but then they changed their mind and instead included a coupon so you could get it in the mail for free. But it's like the mail-in rebate thing where they're like, yeah, if you remember to fill out this form, you'll definitely get the money back. And then nobody remembers to do the form.
I don't think I've ever filled out one of those. Like, I don't know, it's just too much work.
Yeah, too much work. So nonetheless, there was a sequel planned called Beyond Zero Tolerance, Zero Tolerance 2, Beyond Zero Tolerance. And it would have been by the same development studio for Sega Genesis, you know, whatnot.
Beyond Zero Tolerance kind of sounds like how do you go beyond zero, you know what I mean? Like, does that mean it's like going up to 1 or going down?
Beyond Zero Tolerance. So if you have zero tolerance and you go beyond what the tolerance is,
But shouldn't 0 be the lowest, you know?
it should be like no tolerance.
Yeah. Well, with Zero should already be no. I don't know. Maybe they should have called the sequel No Tolerance. That would have been better, yeah.
Maybe this is why the game got canceled, because it's still unknown really why Acclaim chose to cancel the game in production. But nonetheless, I think that this is a really cool story of just like a badass development team. From what I can understand, because after the game was scrapped, and this is the early 90s, the team just uploaded the game onto their website, like the ROM. They're just like, hey, go ahead and download it. It's not finished. It's canceled. But you could at least see what could have been.
Yeah, I respect them posting it though, honestly. Like, I mean, I don't know. It's kind of interesting.
This was after like they did like a whole like campaign to try to get people to write letters to Acclaim to make them change their mind to get the game to still see a release, and that fell through. And they're just like, whatever, just send it. I don't know. I was looking at their website. It still looks very, very, very 90s. Here, I'll send it to you. You can look.
Oh my God, they haven't updated their website in so long.
That's what I'm saying. Look, they even have like the people who made the games. Like these are the people who made the games.
Look at that. Wait, what's with the pool noodle fight in the parking lot?
We'll never know, dude.
What happens if I click play? Oh, it's just a slideshow?
For the slideshow. Yeah, I was like, this is before videos or things, dude. If I understand everything correctly, it seemed like they were just the ones that shared that and just posted their own ROM.
Oh yeah, I respect it, yeah. I mean, I got preserved it. Oh look, they had a little barbecue too.
And that one guy's making like a dinosaur face.
Have you ever heard of Half-Life Blue Shift?
I've heard of it. I've never played it.
It's a standalone DLC for Half-Life 1, right? But did you know that this Blue Shift DLC is repurposed from the Sega Dreamcast version of Half-Life 1?
Was the Sega Dreamcast version of Half-Life 1?
Yeah, it got canceled. It was almost finished, and it was so far that they, just reused stuff like Blue Shift and stuff and ported it to PC. Now, the reason it was canceled is because, I don't know, whenever it was finished, they didn't think it would sell well on the Dreamcast anymore in 2001. As far as I know, the Dreamcast wasn't that successful, right? Am I right?
I'm pretty sure by 2001 they were pretty certain the Dreamcast was dead.
But this was developed by Gearbox, which is interesting, which was one of the first Gearbox projects, this whole Dreamcast port, right? And then they still used Blue Shift, which was one of the first actually published games by Gearbox, which is also interesting. So, but anyways, a leaked build would eventually resurface, and it's pretty far along, and there's a couple performance issues, but you can even put in, there's like even new features like cheat codes, which the computer game never had. Like you can, god cheat and stuff like that. Just, the stuff you would have on consoles back in the day.
So did this just leak online randomly?
Yeah. I mean, there's multiple versions of this that actually leaked, multiple stages of development.
I mean, but you can play it, right?
Right. But I mean, there was also multiplayer planned, I forgot to mention, for the Dreamcast as well.
That could have been like Counter-Strike before Counter-Strike. Okay, so there's another interesting, like old school, like lost game. It's called TimeDiver Eon Man, and it was supposed to be on the NES. And for the most part, not a lot of people knew about this game, except if you were the owner of the issue 45 from February of 1993 of Nintendo Power. There was a 4-page strategy guide on this game that never ended up releasing.
Damn, dude, do you think there's kids who studied like all the tactics?
I'm so
and
ready
stuff?
for this. Yeah,
I'm gonna beat this first day it comes out. And then like it just never comes out, and they're still waiting today.
So what's weird about it is I spent a lot of time looking into this, and I couldn't find how or when it happened. But the game ultimately went unreleased, right? But at some point after 1993, a bootleg version of the game was released into Asian marketplaces called TimeDiver Avenger instead of TimeDiver Eon Man. It was published by something called Nitra, which is short for Nitra Semiconductor Company.
What?
I don't know.
What's going on?
It also seemed like this was like the ROM was just ripped and then bootlegged, and then it was like hacked to change the word to Avenger instead of Eon Man, and like the copyright was changed. So I don't know how this happened. I think it was like possibly a Chinese company that just like ripped it and bootlegged it. Nonetheless, eventually a unmodified ROM, so without the TimeDiver Avenger name, but the original TimeDiver Eon Man name, would end up leaking online in 2007 by Lost Levels. You can now play the game. There are like still bootleg cartridges out there that have the hacked version that had the Avenger tag with it. The physical version of the original one, incredibly rare, but even the bootleg version is kind of rare too. So something interesting. Gameplay looked okay, but it never actually released.
I kind of like the title that the bootleg people give it better.
You like TimeDiver Avenger better than TimeDiver Eon Man?
Yeah, I don't know what Eon Man is supposed to be like. I don't know. So it's kind of weird.
Right. I don't know.
So in this video, we talked a lot about like games that were leaked later, years after they were supposed to release, right?
Right.
But I want to talk about one game that was leaked way before it's supposed to release, and it's still a couple years out, and that's Marvel's Wolverine. Do you remember when there was like the big leak at Insomniac last December?
Yeah, that was rough because it wasn't just like gameplay footage, right? Like it was like a full like builds of the game for PC were leaking and people were playing them.
Yeah, you could go play it, and I don't know. I don't want to show footage of it because, you know, it's spoilers. The game isn't even out, and I mean, it's kind of scummy to leak that, but I still wanted to mention it. I mean, you can technically go find the builds and go play them, right? We know someone who did.
Yeah, for some reason. Yeah.
Some guy we haven't talked to in like years, and he just joins one night, and he tells us
A
he's
Lethal
playing this-
Company. We're in Lethal Company.
yeah.
We randomly joins us Lethal Company.
Yeah.
We're trying to like loot for stuff and he tells us. I mean, it was interesting for sure, but like, I don't know. I feel like it ruins, like if the game's still coming out, right? To play it like a unfinished build.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I don't know. It also obviously is spoilers, which I mean, I don't know. They might change up now that it's leaked, right? They might change the story a little bit, and
I'm sure they will, yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I don't know. But I mean, I don't know. I looked at the gameplay footage. I thought it looked cool, so I don't know. I'm excited for the game after the leaks still.
Maybe it'll have a positive effect. Like people will be like, oh wow, those leaks make the game look really cool.
Right.
And maybe it'll be.
And I mean, like, to be honest, the stuff I've seen wasn't crazy big spoilers. It was just like very minor, like how the game is set up and stuff.
During this whole part, when you're doing the cutaways to the gameplay stuff, since we can't use the gameplay, you should find some like really old Wolverine game.
Like from the PS2.
Yeah, or the PS1 and just have footage of that.
You remember that movie where he went to Japan?
The second like Wolverine movie.
There's a PS2 game, a PS1 game for that.
Okay, yeah, that sounds
That's a
good.
good one. I had that as a kid. That was a
Perfect.
fucking dark game.
Wait, how'd you have that as a kid? That movie came out in like 2014?
Wait, let me see.
I think the one where he goes to Japan was like 2014. 13, 14? I'm stupidly good with years. Unless he goes back to Japan in multiple movies.
Well, let's see. Wolverine. I guess he doesn't go back. He goes there for the first time, I guess. Which one? What was that even called? Was it called The Wolverine?
So they did like 3 Wolverine movies. They did the one with the bad Deadpool, and then they did a sequel to that movie. And the sequel to the movie is the one that I think you're thinking of. It's like part of a Wolverine trilogy that ended with Logan.
Oh, maybe I got it confused. The game I was talking about is called X2 Wolverine's Revenge.
Oh. Have you heard of Rodea?
No, that sounds like a disease.
So, no, it was like an end-of-life Wii game, right? And it was like pretty anticipated, but like it was supposed to come out in like 2010 or something, 2011 maybe, and it just never came out for whatever reason, and it was just taking a long time, and there'd be updates occasionally, and they're like, no, it's still coming out. But then they announced it was coming out on the 3DS also, and that it was almost done with the 3DS version, so it would release on both the Wii and the 3DS. But like the Wii U was already like announced and stuff. So then like things kept taking longer, and they're like, okay, it's actually going to come out on the Wii U, but we haven't forgotten about the Wii people, and it is a confusing mess. But long story short, they developed the game for the Wii, and then they were like, oh, we need to make a Wii U version. So they redeveloped the game for the Wii U and the 3DS. And if you bought the game on the Wii, it only released officially like with the Wii U, right? Like you buy the Wii U box, it has like the blue on it, but inside the game, there was a Wii U disc and a Wii disc with 2 different versions of the game. One that was like developed earlier that uses like motion controls, and then another version for the Wii U that doesn't use motion controls and uses like the same, like the different technology, but they're different games. And then you could invert the box art, and if you flipped it around, it had the Wii logo on the other side, because it was both games. And what's really interesting is the Wii version is the definitive version of the game. The Wii U version is the crappier, worse version of the game. And you wouldn't think that would be the case, but like reviewers played both versions, and they're like, yeah, you should buy the game, throw the Wii U disc out, and just play the Wii version. And the 3DS one wasn't that good either, but it was just a wild story. It doesn't really fit into this whole thing, but I felt like obviously the fact that the publisher wanted them to make a Wii U version, release it on the Wii U, despite the fact that the main game was a Wii game, kind of insinuates to me that the publisher didn't want as many people buying a Wii game anymore. They want people buying a Wii U game. So, I mean, they already finished the other one, so they just threw it in there. It not 100% fits this, but you guys get what I mean. It is It was supposed to be like the lesser experience, but it ended up being the main definitive version of the game.
Right. I like when you said the Wii version was like the better version and the Wii U was like the crappier version. It's almost like an allegory for those two consoles. You know what I mean?
Yes. And mind you, you could play Wii games on the Wii U, so it did make sense in a way. But I don't think we've ever really seen that where they do like the 2 discs things before and the reversible cover.
Different controls and stuff, right? Like, yeah. But you said there was a 3DS version, right?
Yeah, and it wasn't good either.
Okay.
The 3DS version was like compared to it seemed like the 3DS version was developed at the same time and based off of the Wii U version. So the same issues were across the board, but the original Wii version. Solid game.
Dude, honestly, why didn't they make a box where it's also the 3DS cartridge? You know what I mean? Like, might as well, at this point.
Right. Yeah. Oh, dude, they should have put the 3DS and a DS version of the game, too.
Oh. Now we're talking. Game Boy version?
Game Boy
okay, now we go
Advance.
too far back. Talking about going back, have you ever seen the TV show Time Tracks from the early 90s?
No.
It is a crazy premise. It's about this cop from the 22nd century. I think the year... I don't know the exact year, but 22nd century, right? So like in the future. And he's sent back to 1993 to chase after criminals that escaped from the future. And his sidekick is a AI that is like a credit card.
Is this Phil of the future?
No. This is like some crime show from 1993 to 1994.
Okay.
Of the future. Wait, what was it? Wasn't it an episode where he clones himself? Or was it something? I don't know.
I don't know.
Okay, sorry.
I just saw didn't they go to like chase after a caveman or something and then they get stuck?
They did. Yeah, I do remember that. Anyways, this Time Tracks TV show, which I don't think was too popular because I had never heard of it before, and I mean, it doesn't seem like a classic 90s TV show, was supposed to have a Sega Genesis game on top of the NES version that already, on SNES versions that would release eventually, right? There was supposed to be 3 versions, but the Sega Genesis version was the cancelled one. And what's interesting about is for the Sega Genesis version, they reworked all the animations and the sprites, and they even made a soundtrack, which, obviously the NES and SNES weren't able of playing as well as the Sega Genesis at the time. And it, kind of wasn't quite obvious why it was cancelled. It kind of just disappeared from release calendars. And then eventually in 2013, the unfinished prototype of the Genesis version was leaked online. And for a long time, it's been thought this was lost. But I guess after it was leaked, you can go download it and play it. And I mean, I don't know, it doesn't run super well. And it I don't know, it kind of looks pretty much like the SNES version. It really doesn't look that much better.
I mean, it's so cool that it's out there, though.
I mean, yeah, it's cool that it's out there. And I mean, the soundtrack was completely unique. They recomposed. There was like a different composer making the soundtrack. So I guess that was supposed to be the big selling point on top of the better looking graphics. Have you ever seen Silence of the Lambs from the early 90s?
Is that the movie with Morbius?
Morbius? Close. It's the movie with Hannibal. Yeah, Hannibal Lecter, the guy with the mask,
Wasn't there like a canceled game about that?
Yes, there was a canceled PC game. Well,
okay.
Not a canceled PC game for Silence of the Lambs. It was a canceled PC game for the sequel movie that released 10 years after the original movie, which I personally didn't think was as good as the original movie. But that's besides the point. This was fully based on the movie, and there's another sequel called Red Dragon in this trilogy that also would have been featured in this game, or some characters from that would have been featured in this game as well. So this kind of would have tied together some movie stuff, and you were playing as the main character from the first movie as well.
So do we eat people in it?
No, you don't play as Hannibal Lecter. You play as the
Oh.
FBI agent. Now what's interesting, this had some weird mechanic.
I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, that's why the game never released, because he ate people in it. I don't think they would have.
I was like, it sounds like a wild premise, dude. I thought we were talking about the Morbius guy.
The Morbius guy eats people in it.
What movie is he from? Jared Leto. What movie was I thinking of?
Morbius.
No, another movie from back, around the Silence of the Lamb time. Silence of the Lambs time.
Was he alive in 1991? How old is
Dude,
Jared
bro is
Leto?
old. Hold on.
Is he?
52.
Holy shit.
Older than you think, at least, right?
He looks like 30. I don't know.
He probably would thank you for that. But wasn't he in some big artistic movie from the 90s?
I only know him as the Joker.
He's my Joker. He's the only Joker to me. Oh, he was in Fight Club?
But not as a main character, right?
I don't know. He's in American Psycho. Requiem for a Dream. That was the movie I was thinking of.
Oh, I never seen it.
That was in 2000. He was in Phone Booth?
Where the guy can't hang up or he gets shot?
Yeah, he's in the movie, apparently. Wait, Requiem for a Dream, though. Wait.
What's that movie about?
I don't remember, but doesn't it have the music there's a song called Requiem for a Dream. It's like da na 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 na.
I think so, yeah. You ever seen that movie with Christian Bale where you're not allowed to have emotions in the future?
No. What? Okay, so Silence of the Lambs came out in 1991, so I was a little bit off.
And then 10 years later, Hannibal released, right? Which was a sequel. So they took 10 years to make the sequel, which is already not a good sign.
I thought I had some really big insight coming in, but I lost it. Sorry, go ahead. Continue your part.
I don't know. Where was it? Oh, I was going to talk about the game mechanics. So the game mechanics were supposed to have like this anxiety meter, and like you would walk through stuff, and like the anxiety would go up, and the level would kind of change, and how you perceive things and how you see NPCs would change on how high your anxiety is. I guess something similar that Amnesia did. I don't know. It's not really clear how it would have worked, right? And you know, with the limited gameplay footage we do have, it's kind of hard to tell. But I don't know. It did look interesting. Now, I didn't find any gameplay on YouTube, which makes me think that they might be DMCAing like re-uploads of it. But there's a leaked build you can download, so I'm not too sure if we can show gameplay footage of it. There's a trailer, and I'll just mix that in a little bit. But essentially the game took too long to develop, and they were like, nobody's going to be interested in this game anymore 2 years after the movie Hannibal came out.
So, like, hypothetically, if we wanted to play it after the podcast, we could. Not that we're going to.
Yeah. And, yeah. I mean, the build was leaked in 2009, so it's been on the internet for a long time now.
Silence of the Lambs.
Good movie, though.
Are there lamps in it?
Kind of. I mean, she talks about lambs.
Lambs or lamps?
Lambs. Lambs? Lambs. The
Like the light.
goat. The sounds of the goat.
A lamb.
Lamb, yeah.
Oh, I thought we were talking. Okay.
Bro, this ain't fucking Home Depot. Okay.
Just leave that in. Don't even censor that. Just leave that whole line. First F word in a Rocket Solve video. Just leave that part in and just cut right after.
I don't know if it's the first one. Is it the first one? Probably. Maybe. I don't know. Okay, I have another canceled game that got leaked online called FreakBoy. And that is a very weird name. Nonetheless, it wasn't like because the guy was really freaky, right? That wasn't the purpose of the game. He was just like a freak, I guess, but not a sexual freak. I don't know.
Like, what type of freak?
Like, he just looked like... Okay, sorry. The whole premise was that this guy could swap his head, his torso, and his legs to different abilities depending on objects he would pick up in the world. It was like a 3D platformer. It kind of like how Kirby can suck in people and then use their abilities. But this guy could change like different parts of his body. That's why he's a freak, you know? Okay. I guess so. I don't know. That's,
I mean, yeah, it sounds
I don't
sounds
really
fun.
find the explanation. That's all. Like, the guy just looks freaky. But
okay. Why was it canceled?
I don't know, probably it's too freaky, dude.
Fair enough.
No, I think that was just like management issues, you know, it's like the 90s.
The stereotypical 90s game experience. Okay.
Yeah, the classic. And in 2015, the prototype actually was found in a sale or in a garage sale, or it wasn't even a garage sale. I think the article said it was a car boot sale. So someone was selling like old stuff from the back of their trunk, and someone bought this cartridge and then posted it online, and that's how we have the leaked build. So I don't know, kind of a weird story how this got here.
Very wholesome.
Yeah, but apparently it's pretty far along. There's 25 levels, which I think
25?
that's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah. For a 3D platform in the 90s, 25 levels. Like, it's insane.
That's
and they're
insane.
all like they're all separate themes. Like someone poured their heart and soul into this FreakBoy game. And then Virgin Entertainment closed down and it was never published, so...
So sad, but wholesome.
A wholesome freak boy. Another weird cancel game that I'd never heard of before doing research was called The Last Job for the PlayStation 2. And it was like this heist game where 4 characters do a heist and they all have like their different abilities and objectives that they do. So you would go through, you know, do like one thing with one character, then it would switch over to the next character. And, you know, there was different settings, like, you know, like the heist stuff. It kind of like sounds like Payday almost, you know? But instead of playing with friends, you were just alone. I guess it's just like the loner version of Payday. Nonetheless, that's another prototype that leaked eventually, but that game was about 40% complete, and I look at gameplay of it, and it's pretty rough. Apparently, like, you can fall through the floor, and then you have to reset the game. So, you know, they didn't really map everything out. They showed it off at E3, though, at closed doors. So it was shown to journalists at some point. So there were big plans for this game. We didn't quite know much about it until actually in 2024 when it was posted on games that weren't. We could just download it and play it on a PS2 emulator, and you can kind of go explore for yourself. So yeah.
Now, just in case some of you guys are confused at the lighting change or the slight difference change, because this is a longer video, Luke and I did record these in 2 separate sections so we could do a little research in between. So
if it's daytime all of a sudden, especially from Luke's perspective. Were you wearing a white shirt when we recorded yesterday?
Yeah, I think so. I mean...
Okay, so there's some continuity. We didn't have to... Just other than the time of day.
Yeah, I mean, just, like, ignore this. Actually...
Oh my god. Are you recording from heaven?
Yeah, this is, like, the where Lost happened, right there outside my window. Because they were all in heaven the whole time, right?
That's not... No, that's not... so what do you got for us?
Okay. Last time we left off with The Last Job, I believe. So... The next game I wanted to talk about was Baldur's Gate for the PlayStation 1. So, I don't know how much you know about the Baldur's Gate history, but in the early days, it was a PC-only franchise, right? And I think Baldur's Gate 3 might be the only title that made it to console. And I mean, we played it a little bit. And I don't know, we've probably talked about this, but when we played it, Elijah had his companion and he stole his clothes. So there was just like this naked guy running around in our...
I just couldn't understand the game. I didn't understand how we were supposed to play the game. It's just a little too confusing, a little beyond my comprehension.
I mean, it was just funny, you know? All of a sudden he had his companion's clothes on and the guy was just running around naked.
Was I naked or was I wearing like a dress or something?
No, you wore the guy's clothes. The guy was naked. It was like the elf with like the locks. I don't know. And it's just like, I don't know, I'm just walking around, all of a sudden I see Schlong. You know what I mean? Like in the background. I don't know. Can I say that in the video? Do I have to censor?
I think you can. Okay. I think you've already said some other stuff.
Okay. Anyways, so Baldur's Gate 1 released in the 90s, and around 1999, they started working on a PlayStation 1 port.
Wait, PlayStation 1?
Yeah, so like way back. But they ran into issues because, you know, there was like, the way the game works, they couldn't really figure out how to make the mechanics all work with like the PlayStation controller back in the day, right? It was really hard to take a PC game with like, you know, mouse and keyboard controls and put it on a PlayStation 1 console. And that's kind of why they stopped developing it. And initially, you know, it would have taken them too long to finish it. And I don't know, markets were probably shifting. They probably didn't want to risk it, right? They probably would have lost money on it. But a playable prototype of this port was leaked in 2009. And it came from someone who purchased the disc with the game on it for a 4-figure sum. So we don't know the exact price that it was bought for, but someone bought it pretty expensively.
For like the thousands of dollars. Or at least 1,000.
I mean, at least $1,000, maybe $4,000, I don't know. I couldn't find the exact number. So, yeah, and that guy made it publicly available. What a hero. And, I mean, the game is pretty unfinished, but it's a playable version, and there's a lot of the content that you can access, and it's pretty laggy and not that polished. But, I don't know, I just think it's a cool piece of gaming history.
I think it's always cool whenever that type of stuff ends up, like, leaking in some way or another, even if it's unfinished. Earlier in the video, we talked about Resident Evil for the Game Boy, and that was one, too, where I was like, you know, it never finished. The game's not playable like all the way through, but for what they did have there, it was pretty impressive. Like, you know, they were really trying, like, all the cutscenes in the Game Boy form. So I don't know, whenever I see stuff like that, especially like something that obviously is running on like lower end hardware, it's pretty neat.
Yeah, and that's another thing they did for this Baldur's Gate version. They changed some of the cutscenes. I'm not quite sure in which way, but I think they like either cut them short or like, you know, changed them a little bit so they would run on PlayStation. So, I don't know. I just think, like, I mean, people worked on this, and it's just cool that it's preserved in a way.
It's a piece of gaming history. Yeah. And at the same time, this kind of actually ties into some of the things I wanted to talk about today, because we have a lot of games that are notorious for being, like, rare, expensive games, right? Like if you, I mean, we most of the time talk about, like, the generation that Luke and I grew up with, which is, like, the late 90s into the, you know, late 2000s. But the generation kind of before us has a community of people who've shared ROMs regularly, even if the games are incredibly rare. So there were a couple of games we've all heard of, like the Nintendo World Championship game, right?
Yeah, like the editions or whatever.
Yeah, there was like a Nintendo World Championship series, and they had special cartridges that they used, and some of them are rarer than others, and there was only like a handful of ones made. And for a long time, like, yes, they had the reputation of being the most expensive games, but at the same time, the ROMs would leak online. So someone out there who had the game and either held onto it or paid the high figures or the high dollar amount to get those games still put the ROMs online, so people could at least go in for historical context and see
what the game was like. And I don't think that necessarily takes away from the value of the collectible, because you actually have the real cartridge. When you get into the whole, sure, there's reproduction carts and stuff out there that are sold or whatever, but I still think it's really cool whenever the ROMs get posted out there for the community to at least get a look at what was there.
I have a question. Didn't they publish the Nintendo Championship games on the Switch?
I think recently they had announced that they were doing a big special edition that would let you play those games too. But for a long time, obviously, there was no acknowledgement from Nintendo that these even existed. I think they might have even done something with the old one a few years back, possibly, with those NES remix games. I don't know if those were a direct tie-in, but it was similar. But nonetheless, Nintendo at least acknowledges that the Nintendo World Championship was something that happened back in the day. They brought it back a few years back. We haven't had one in 7 years, but it was cool when it did come back. But yeah, just in general, it's cool now. The Switch thing that's releasing for it, getting all ready to go. I don't know. That stuff's all neat. There was another competition actually that I thought was really interesting too. A little less known, but from what I could tell, a lot of people remember this, and I found conflicting information about it. So maybe I can present this, and if anyone in the comments can figure this one out and clarify. But there was the Blockbuster World Video Game Championship 2. I guess they did 2 different championships, but the cartridge specifically for the Video Game Championship number 2 is super, super rare. So I don't know what ended up happening with why there's so much confusion about this, but nonetheless, there was 2 games on it: NBA Tournament and Judge Dredd. And so I in some reports and outlets that I've read, it was suggesting that there was, let's see here, this is from an entertainment.ie. They said that there was 2 or 3 copies of the cartridge existing that they used for this championship, and their estimated values $9,000 to $15,000. I don't think that there was only 2 or 3. I think more likely there's maybe 50, maybe less, but I think more than 2 or 3, because in the comment section of a video, someone had uploaded gameplay footage from it. I saw people talking about remembering participating in the event directly, right? So I have a feeling that there was probably more than just a couple made, if so many people just readily in the YouTube comment section remember competing at various Blockbusters and how these Blockbusters had it. I still think it's very rare, but especially because if it was something like Blockbuster had, they probably had to send it back to Sega after they were done with the championship. So I don't know how many copies exist, but what's important is someone has a copy and they uploaded the ROM online. And that's why we have footage and stuff nowadays, because people are able to emulate it and get footage of it and show what it was like. And then people who did participate can kind of have a little nostalgia trip and be oh yeah, when I was 10, I competed in that. And I don't know. I think that type of stuff is kind of cool too.
Yeah. Also, I do have to say, it's a weird mix. They got a Judge Dredd game and an NBA game on this cartridge. It's
right.
Just a most random. How does this even work with the rights? You know what I mean? One is a movie franchise and one is the NBA. It's a crazy cartridge.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of wild.
And this was for the Sega Genesis, right?
Yes.
When did the Genesis stop being a thing?
The Genesis was what, to compete with the NES, the Super Nintendo?
I think so, yeah. And the Mega Drive is the same thing, right? Just different market.
Right, just a different name for Europe. It was released in 1989. So I guess maybe it was more to compete with the NES, not the Super Nintendo. But it was a 16-bit console.
Okay. I see. I never really played any Sega consoles when I was a kid. They just weren't... I never even saw them in the store, to be honest.
I went to... there was a video game store. I want to say it had a weird name. It's not like GameStop. It was Funko Land or Funland. Maybe not Funko.
Wait, that's what GameStop is nowadays. Funko Land, dude, because they all got the Funko Pops on the shelf, dude.
No, wait. What was it? Funland? Maybe someone...
Funkoland is an American video game retailer.
Yeah, was that what it was called?
Funkoland, yeah, with a C.
It was in the Pacific Northwest area.
The tagline was "Bring home the fun."
Bring home the fun. So, you actually know where this location is, but I don't want to dox ourselves. But
I don't know if we ever been in person to this, but we've definitely been in the area where the store used to be.
You want to tell me off camera? I'll cut it out. Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So that was a Funkoland. A friend's parent told my parents that they had good video games there, used games there.
Oh.
And we went there because I wanted to get a used copy of Pokemon. Because I had Pokemon Yellow as a kid, and then I took like a couple years off because I was like really young when I had Pokemon Yellow, so I couldn't read and it was hard. So I had Pokemon Silver and Pokemon Sapphire, but I didn't have Pokemon Red or Blue. I'd only played Pokemon Yellow, so I went to Funkoland to get that, and they had in that store they had like the display where you could play the different systems, and they had a Dreamcast there. And that's the first time I played a Sega Dreamcast. So that was probably my first Sega console.
Yeah. I don't know. I always thought the handheld looked weird. Or interesting, at least. I wanted to try
The
it.
controller?
Yeah.
The Dreamcast controller had the little like miniature screen on the controller. Is that what you're talking about, or?
Yeah. And couldn't you like slide the rumble pack in the back or something? Or wasn't there like attachments for it?
It was like a little screen that went in the Dreamcast controller. I forgot what it was called.
Oh, and you could take it out? Was that it?
You could like take it out, yeah, and like take it with you, like a Tamagotchi.
Tamagotchi, okay.
You know, like have the little
the little thing you don't want to die. You gotta keep feeding it. Also, I found an ad from Funkoland, and I'm not sure which year this is, but they got Pokemon Blue for $30, Pinball for $35, and a Game Boy Color for $80. Oh, and James Bond for $40, dude.
Dude, I was Funkoland only where we lived, or were they like regional or like larger?
No, it says they are from Minnesota, actually.
Oh, so more people out there probably know what Funkoland is if they're around our age.
They should. I mean, yeah, I don't know if I don't think it was nationwide, but they definitely were in a good amount of states.
It's interesting. Our Funkoland ended up closing down and immediately getting turned into a GameStop.
Yeah, because they merged with GameStop as a company.
Oh,
that's where GameStop
that
comes
makes
from.
Sense.
They formed GameStop with another company.
Wait, was GameStop already a thing before, though?
No, they merged with a company called Baba Gage. I don't know, never heard. I can't really find information, but it says merged with Baba Gage's to form GameStop. And it says successor GameStop. So yeah, Funkoland directly turned to do GameStop.
Wow. So I just dated myself hard, and that was it. Just GameStop's old name, pretty much.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And in Canada, it's called EB Games, right?
I think so. EB Games was its own thing for a long time, because we had EB Games separately, like different locations. There was like one in our mall, maybe.
Oh, really?
And then EB Games got acquired by GameStop. And
I see.
EB Games started changing their names. At least here.
Look at us. Learning about the history of GameStop.
Right.
Before it's too late, dude.
So did Funkoland stop being a thing? What year was that? 99?
2000.
2000. So maybe our store was slow at changing its name from Funkoland to GameStop?
Yeah, it says December 2000 is when the company went defunct.
Interesting. Because I know for a fact, this was like 2002? Is that when I went to Funkoland? Maybe 2001? So maybe they just left the old sign up for a long time.
Oh, they were also... I think they were owned by Barnes & Nobles. Or did they get bought by Barnes & Nobles? I don't know. Maybe the Funkoland logo and marketing is owned by Barnes & Nobles. They should bring it back. Like a little section in their bookstores called Funkoland. You know how Macy's has the Toys R Us?
Right. Dude, our Macy's wasn't even a Macy's. It was a Bon Marché.
A Bon Marché? What the hell?
And then they changed it when Macy's acquired them. They changed it to Bon Macy's. And then just Macy's.
By the way, you ever seen that video where the guy's like, we're outside Barney's and no Blaze?
Dude, you get your clothes at Jacques Penney.
Jacques Penney, dude. Actually, I used to buy clothes at Jacques Penney.
Yeah. Okay,
okay. We're a little off track. Okay, let's get back to... Do you have any more rare...
Yeah. Going back, on the topic of old games that are like super rare, but people uploaded the ROMs for because they're homies. There was an Atari 2600 game called... Birthday Mania, and this is interesting, but it seemed to be like a personalized game. It was only sold in the state of New Jersey.
What?
And it was like a birthday gift. Like when you would load up the game, it would actually have the person's name
the birthday person's name pop up on the screen with a happy birthday to you.
Oh, so it's just like say happy birthday Jimmy or whatever the person's name was.
It would say Jimmy, happy birthday to you. And then you like there's like some mini game where you blow out candles.
That's it. I mean, I guess it's a Atari 2600 game. What was I expecting?
But yeah, so that was something that existed. There weren't too many copies, I guess, out there. It is very niche, and I assume that since you had to like customize it, you probably had to like order it. And this is like the 80s, so you probably had to do like a form and like mail it in, and then they'd mail it back. So not very common, but it does remind me another thing. We're gonna go a little off topic for a quick second, but Barney had a similar thing where you could this is in the 90s, you could take a picture of like your kid and send it to some like address, and they would crop the face out and put it in this like thing, and then there'd be a Barney episode on VHS, and then they would mail it to you.
Interesting.
For your birthday. And I had it as a kid. My mom got it for like my 3rd or 4th birthday.
Do you still have it somewhere?
Probably somewhere.
You should find it. We should
watch it
and and put it on YouTube.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure my mom heard about it on the Oprah Winfrey show.
Oh,
and then they did like a segment on it, and then for my birthday I got it. It was pretty cool.
That's actually sick. Yeah, I mean, I don't remember when the internet came up. You could do stuff like that, right, on some websites. You remember like those websites that would do it like
right, yeah, and then do a little elf dancing. Or whatever.
Yeah.
Dude, we should get our pictures and do the elf dance.
I remember there was like a Chippendales one.
Oh, heck yeah.
You, me, them.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think it's cool that like before the internet era though, like having like just like ordering magazines or whenever they're like, oh, you can get this game attachment, but like you have to fill out like in the magazine the subscription card, fill it out, and then put it like and mail it. You know what I mean? Like that stuff's always interesting to me.
I never really mailed in this stuff, but as a kid we had like these Mickey Mouse comics, and they were like weekly releases. It was like, I don't know how to explain, like German manga. And I don't think you had them in America, but you could like order them per like a postcard. And I think that's the only postcard I ever filled out.
We had something like that. I think you could do a lot of comic books and magazine subscriptions that way. If you bought a magazine at a store, it would always have the little postcard that you could fill out to continue your subscription. But I definitely did have like Rugrats or something, like Rugrats comics sent over.
Dude, remember movie magazines too? Like that's such like a TV guide. You would just get like what's on TV for the next week per mail. It's just such a weird concept. Like I don't know, like thinking about it now. Oh well, sorry.
I've one more game on my list that I really wanted to talk about. It's called The King of Fighters 2000. I mean, you probably have heard of the King of Fighters series. SNK was kind of like a notorious game studio, but they were going bankrupt, and they're like, we got to get this game out now. And they were like producing the game, like releasing it and stuff like in a rush. But the Neo Geo version of the game apparently is incredibly rare. There's just not a lot of copies of that one. Some sources claim that there's only 100 copies that were made for the Neo Geo version of the game, which means that if it ever goes on sale or whenever it goes on sale, it usually is looking at like $4,000 to $7,000.
Was there even the 100 Neo Geo consoles sold?
That was the biggest thing that surprised me, is that 100 people bought a Neo Geo.
Yeah, is there even like enough install base? You know what's going on?
Yeah, I don't know. But so that's something interesting that's rare. But of course, the ROM has leaked out there, so you could at least check it out and see what it was like all these years later. So I think that's kind of neat. No, that was it.
Right. I do have so I have more games, but I do have one more that kind of fits here too. Have you ever heard of Starfox Super Weekend?
Starfox Super Weekend?
Yeah.
I've heard of it. As a kid, I was like a stupid Starfox like hardcore fan, and I've heard about it. It was like a Starfox like competitive cartridge, right?
Right. And I mean that one is incredibly rare too, right? Like it's hard to get, but someone did also leak that one online eventually in 2009.
Oh, really? I never knew that got leaked.
Yeah. So I thought it was an interesting story. I'm not quite sure what's quite different about it. I think like all the levels are on timers or something, and that's why it's like the Super Weekend Edition. I don't know. It was like some video game competition where you could win it, or maybe
wasn't there something about Starfox and like this like weird like limbo level in the game that like never ends and plays like The Saints Go Marching On creepily.
The Saints Go Marching On. No, I don't know about that.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, that sounds like a creepypasta, dude.
I know. I'm pretty sure this is real. If this is real, we left it in the video, and I'll record right now. This is me in the. I'm gonna record something in the future
explaining what it is, and we'll just insert it right here.
Okay, so I ended up looking it up, and in the original Star Fox game, there is a secret Easter egg / alternate ending for the game that's a little bit weird. Essentially, there is a secret location called Out of This Dimension, or it's like an external place on the map. You can only get if you finish Corneria on level 3 and play on the asteroid belt on level 3. You then destroy the second large asteroid. This weird egg-like thing will come out, and it'll fly away, and then it'll come back and hatch into a giant bird, maybe like a phoenix or something. However, if you then fly directly into the bird, you will enter this mysterious out of this dimension type thing. This then takes you to a completely different level. And there are several hints suggesting that Fox is like lost in space now, as like General Pepper makes some dialogue. But you're automatically thrown into this really strange and very difficult level. Not only is the background warped and weird, but there's also a non-stop rotation of enemies constantly coming in. His background keeps doing this weird thing, but if you manage to survive long enough, you will encounter this mysterious boss fight of a slot machine, which is weird in itself. If you're able to beat this one here, you then are just stuck in space still. No end to the level, you're just flying around. You will see the text appear saying the end, but you're still playing. And you can shoot the letters, and they can revert back, and enemies can even shoot the letters, messing them up. Enemies will continue to swarm you, and you're just stuck here infinitely. Also, the song choices are interesting here, as we hear Johann Strauss II's Voice of Spring. And also, you hear this weird version of When the Saints Go Marching In. There's no escape here. You either die or you play infinitely until you turn your system off. So ultimately, I don't know. This one's kind of weird. Wow, wasn't that creepy, Luke?
That was so creepy, dude. That was insane.
Okay.
We should do a reaction for it if it's not creepy.
Oh, I guess it wasn't as creepy as we thought, Luke.
Ah, damn.
You just leave both reactions.
Yeah, just leave all of this in. Like, I don't know. Also, that reminds me, do you remember Metroid Prime First Hunter? Like the little demo you got with buying a DS?
Right, I remember those being sold at GameStop used for like really expensive, tricking kids and think it was the full game.
I think I still have that somewhere, like, with me.
What about it?
I don't know, I just remember it. Please
just remember it existed.
I mean, the Starfox thing kind of made me remember it, you know what I mean?
Why?
I think, like, I don't know, just because they gave out cartridges for promotions back in the day.
Oh, but the Star Fox Super Weekend was like a Comtest disc, right?
I don't know if you got it from a Comtest. I think it was just, like, given out.
It was like used. Oh, I thought it was used like at the venue.
Oh, it might have been used at the venue, but I think you could just, like, get it. I don't think you had to win to get it. But there's still a limited amount of them out there, right? And I saw one for sale for like 5,000, which, I mean, that's not too bad compared to some of the other prices. But now going back from all this, you know, rare game stuff we had, there's another couple of games that I wanted to talk about that were kind of interesting. And one of them is the leaked build for the canceled Star Wars Battlefront 3, which was canceled in 2008, which I always thought was kind of interesting that we got this build out there, because it is pretty unfinished, and when you play it, I think it's really, really laggy. It's like super unpolished. I couldn't find footage of it that wasn't like 3 FPS. Like, it was really hard. So I don't know if like the people recording, but I mean, all the videos I watched, the footage were just incredibly stuttery. So when we show it on screen and it's lagging, it's not the video, it's just how the game, that's the gameplay. And I mean, obviously, they never had the time to finish it because Free Radical went out of business in 2008, right?
Right. Wasn't there... I think there was a lot of speculation that, like, or question as to whether or not the game even existed. That they had actually even started doing, like, a prototype of what Star Wars Battlefront 3 would be. So it was significant when it ended up dropping, right?
Right. It was a big deal because, yeah, I mean, also, you know how big Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2 were back in the day. You know, people wanted a third one. People nowadays want a third one of the shit trilogy, or, you know what I mean?
The controversial.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed them, but they were definitely different than the original ones. And I don't know, it's just interesting. But I mean, yeah, when you look at it, it does look like Star Wars Battlefront 2. But the build that was leaked was for 360, so, you know, they would have made the jump to next gen.
Yo, we should try that. Hypothetically.
I mean, we have the modded Xboxes, right? We can try to get it on there.
Hypothetically. We would never have proprietary software.
And another fun fact that I've written down about this is that there is another Star Wars game from around the same time that was developed for the Wii that never released, but apparently is fully finished. So maybe one day that game will leak as well. It's the Star Wars Rogue Leaders Rogue Squadron game for the Wii. And apparently it's 100% complete, just never was published.
Really?
People are still waiting for that to leak online.
I never realized it was that far finished.
Yeah, no. It was made by the studio that made the original one. And I think this Wii version was supposed to include the first 2 or 3 games, and then also the sequel. And they tidied it up, and I don't know, I guess I don't know. I couldn't find the real reason why it wasn't.
They just forgot to release it.
Maybe they forgot, yeah. But maybe they'll leak someday, and then it would be on this list, you know what I mean? Another interesting one is Toon Panic, which kind of looks like a Smash clone on the N64, which obviously, you know, Smash just came out on the N64, so I guess I don't know if I can call it a Smash clone yet if it released within the same generation, but maybe, yeah.
What was the game?
It was supposed to have, like, these stages, but it was different than, you know how the Smash Bros. Stages are like, you look at them sideways like a platform, right? This game would have had more like, the arena was more like 3D, but still 2D. Does that make sense? The angle was like different. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting. And I mean, or this game didn't make it very far in development, and the company went bankrupt in 2000. But the prototype was bought in Japan for $3,500 in 2005, and then 3 years later was dumped online. And you're able to play what is there. And I mean, it's a very limited game. Apparently, there's only like a couple characters, and a lot of the stages don't work, and the features aren't implemented yet right either. Also, there's no AI in the multiplayer, and the single player doesn't work, so like it's very, very limited. But
Okay.
When you look at it and you see gameplay of it, it definitely looks interesting. I don't think it would have been tied to any IP, like, you know, how Smash Bros. Had like all the Nintendo characters. I think it would have just like been a couple of Toon characters fighting, you know, some classic stuff like that. Yeah.
Just fighting it out, dude. Do you think it's better than Multiverses?
Dude, Multiverses, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a bit, I mean, I don't know, dude. I mean, Multiverses must be better because at least there's more than one map that works.
Yeah, I guess so. I thought this was going to be a chance for you to finally get to dunk on Multiverses for how you feel about it.
I bought that Harley Quinn thing and then they removed the game, you know. I'm still a little salty about it. But, I mean, they brought it back, but now my interest is gone. And then the last one I have on my list is called Bioforce Ape, which was a action platformer for the NES that was cancelled in 1992. The reason it was cancelled was just because, like, I don't know, they thought the market was oversaturated with games like this. And I mean, if you look at gameplay, it does look very generic, like any NES platformer looked back in those days. But eventually, someone in 2005 called Paul Brown posted that he discovered a prototype cartridge of Bioforce Ape, right? And he posted a picture of the cartridge being like kind of destroyed, right? Like the plastic was cracked and like the pieces were kind of fallen into the cartridge. And people were like, oh, someone finally found it. But it turned out that was a hoax. So this guy like just faked this cartridge and pretended it was this lost game for the NES.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and another 5 years would go by before in 2010, a Japanese auction, someone bought it for like $2,700 and then later dumped it to the Lost Levels community. And I mean, the prototype, it's playable. I mean, I don't know. It's like from start to finish, you can play it. There isn't any major glitches. I don't know. It's just kind of a generic looking game. I don't know. Like, it just looks like Contra maybe, or, you know, like games like that. You know, there was a lot on the NES like that. I mean, I think they made like movie games, even like these action platforms, like the Home Alone games and stuff. I don't know. It's just, I don't know how nowadays everyone is getting like an open world, like time wasting game, dude. Back in the day, everybody got a beat 'em up action platformer.
Right. How do you fill the time nowadays, dude?
Just make it open world. Just make it extremely long and tedious.
Throw a couple fetch quests in.
The Ubisoft formula. I can't wait for the Rainbow Six Siege campaign where we like walk around aimlessly.
Dude, I'm so excited. Well, what do you guys think? Did we do a good job? Thank you to our patrons for supporting our show and helping us with this stuff. We make long form content because of our support on Patreon. So if you've enjoyed this, consider either becoming a patron or becoming a YouTube member. We appreciate that. And that's it.
That's it.
Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you soon with another long video. We have one coming up. Don't worry.
Bye-bye.